Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The light in the hallway did not so much burn as it breathed. It was an old thing, a glass bulb encased in a floral-patterned brass fixture that my grandmother had called a tulip, and its glow was the color of weak tea. It pulsed, you see, not with the frantic stutter of a dying fluorescent tube, but with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a deep and tidal inhalation and exhalation of luminance that cast the long corridor into a state of perpetual twilight. I would stand at its threshold, a boy of 7, and watch the shadows in the bedrooms at the far end swell and recede, as if the house itself were a great slumbering beast, and this was the artery leading to its heart. The wallpaper, a faded pattern of vines and unblinking flowers, seemed to coil and uncoil in the shifting light. I never told my parents. They would have smiled, those tired, kind smiles reserved for a child's overactive imagination, and told me it was just the voltage, old wiring in an old house. But I knew. The house was breathing, and I was the only one who could hear it. We were ordinary people, my family. My father taught history at the high school, his own life a neatly cataloged sequence of dates and facts that offered him comfort. My mother painted watercolors of the garden, her world a soft blur of pastel hues. They were good people, the kind who believed in the solidity of things, in the reassuring weight of a doorknob, the finality of a closed door. I was the dreamer, the one who lingered at the edges of the playground, who saw faces in the grain of the wooden floorboards. I was the one the house chose to listen to. The first true omen came not as a sound, but as a smell. It was autumn, the air crisp with the scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke. I was 10. A new smell seeped into the fabric of the house, a dry, ancient odor like that of a long-closed Bible, of pressed flowers turned to dust. It was strongest in my room, emanating from the closet with the slatted door. I would lie in bed, the pulse of the hallway light a distant heartbeat, and watch the slats, convinced that a deeper darkness was moving behind them. One night, driven by a fear that had curdled into a desperate need to know, I crept from my bed and put my eye to a crack. I saw nothing but an abyssal blackness, a void so complete it felt solid. And then, from within that, something shifted. A sound, not a rustle of cloth or the scuttle of a mouse, but a dry, papery whisper, like pages of a book being slowly turned by an unseen hand. The smell of old paper bloomed, thick and cloying in my throat. I stumbled back to bed and pulled the covers over my head, but the whisper followed me into my dreams, a sibilant thread stitching itself into the fabric of my sleep. The occurrences accumulated like dust in a neglected room, each one a single grain of dread. A framed photograph of my great-grandfather would be found tilted on the wall, his stern eyes seeming to follow you no matter where you stood in the room. The radio in the kitchen, a great hulking Philco, would sometimes crackle to life in the dead of night, emitting not music or voices, but a low, guttural static that sounded like a man trying to speak through a mouthful of mud. My parents dismissed it all. A draft. A power surge. They built a fortress of normality around themselves, brick by logical brick. And I lived alone in the space between their walls and the house's true nature. I found the book the summer I turned 16. A season of thick, humid air that clung to the skin like a shroud. It was in the attic, a place I was normally forbidden to enter. A kingdom of heat and forgotten things. The air was thick with the ghosts of camphor and decay. The book was tucked inside a mildewed steamer trunk, bound in a leather that felt unsettlingly like cold, dry skin. There was no title on the cover, only a symbol that resembled a spiral with a single, unblinking eye at its center. The pages were brittle, filled with cramped, handwritten script in an ink the color of old blood. It was not written in any language I could recognize. The letters were jagged, angular things that seemed to squirm on the page if I stared at them too long. But as I traced them with my finger, a coldness seeping into my skin from the paper, I did not read the words so much as absorb their meaning. They were not stories. They were accounts. Tales of ordinary individuals, outcasts and fragile souls who had lived in this house, who had listened to its breath and witnessed its shifting shadows. They spoke of the wanderer, a presence that existed in the spaces between the walls, a thing of silence and dust that was neither alive nor dead, but simply waiting. It fed on loneliness, on the quiet despair of those who felt unseen. It collected them, their fears, their sorrows, their final fleeting moments were the ink in this book, the whispers in the walls, the pulse of the light in the hall. This was the revelation, cold and absolute. The house was not haunted by a ghost. It was a living museum of sorrow, a curator of quiet tragedies. My great-grandfather, who had lost his wife in childbirth and spent 40 years in silent, stoic grief. The spinster aunt who had painted birds that never sang. The generations of ordinary people, just like my family, whose unspoken pains had seeped into the very plaster and floorboards, given form and hunger by the patient, ageless presence of the wanderer. We were not its victims. We were its sustenance. The climax began with a silence. It was a deep, snow-blanketed night in December. The usual sounds of the house, the groan of a floorboard, the sigh of the furnace, had ceased entirely. The breathing light in the hall had stilled, frozen in a state of half-illumination. The silence was a physical pressure in my ears. I rose from my bed, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and opened my door. The hallway stretched before me, a tunnel of frozen tea-colored light, and at the far end, where the shadows of the bedrooms should have been, stood a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, a man-shaped void cut from the fabric of reality itself. It had no face, no features, only a profound absence that hurt to look at. It was the concentration of every whispered fear, every stifled sob, every lonely hour this house had ever known. It was the wanderer. It did not move toward me. It simply was, and in its presence, the memories that were not my own flooded into me. I felt the searing pain of my great-grandfather's loss, the hollow ache of the spinster's loneliness, the quiet terror of a child who saw the walls breathe. They were all there inside me, a chorus of anguish. The thing began to drink it in, to draw my own burgeoning fear into its eternal collection. I was to become another tale in its dark book, another whisper in its silent halls. I felt myself unraveling, my sense of self dissolving into that chorus of the damned. But then I thought of my father, with his neatly ordered facts, and my mother, with her soft, watercolor world. They were ordinary. They were fragile. They were next. A terrible, defiant anger rose in me, a final, solid core of self in that dissolving moment. I did not scream. I did not run. I looked directly into the faceless void and I spoke, my voice a dry rasp in the overwhelming silence. "I see you," I said. The thing recoiled. It was not a physical movement, but a shudder in the air, a fracture in the silence. It was not used to being acknowledged, to being named by the scene. The hallway light flickered once, violently, and then the figure was gone. The pressure vanished. The house gave a great, shuddering sigh, and then was still. I never saw the wanderer again. The light in the hall now burns with a steady, mundane glow. The smells and sounds have faded. My parents live out their peaceful, ordinary lives, untouched and unknowing. I am the outcast now, the one who knows what lies beneath the surface of the world. I live in the house still, caring for them in their old age, a wanderer caught between their reality and my own terrible fantasy. I am the guardian of the threshold, the silent sentinel against the thing that feeds on fragility. And now, in the deep, quiet hours of the night, when the world is asleep and the darkness is absolute, I hear it. It is the only sound that remains. It comes from the walls, a soft, steady, rhythmic sound. It is not a whisper. It is not a breath. It is the sound of a page, dry and ancient, being slowly, carefully turned. It is the sound of the story continuing. It is the sound of waiting, and it will never, ever stop. The turning of the page is my constant companion. It is the metronome of my life, measuring out the days I spend tending the garden my mother still paints, and listening to my father recount the safe, dead past. They are happy. They are content in their dotage, their minds having built such strong, simple walls that the house's true voice is to them nothing more than the wind in the eaves or the settling of old timber. They see me as a devoted son, perhaps a little too quiet, a little too prone to staring into the middle distance. They do not see the vigilance behind my eyes, the constant, low-grade hum of listening. I am 37. The house is mine now, legally and spiritually. I have repaired the roof, repainted the shutters, all the while ensuring that nothing of its essential nature is disturbed. I dare not. The silence that followed my confrontation was not a victory, but a treaty, an understanding. I see it, and in return, it does not cross the threshold of my parents' perception. It feeds on the echoes of my own solitude, a subtle tax I pay for their peace. The book remains in the attic. I check on it sometimes, a reluctant pilgrim. The trunk is gone, consumed by dry rot years ago, but the book lies on a bare plank floor, untouched by dust or pest. The spiral eye on the cover seems to watch me as I approach. I never open it. I do not need to. I know that new pages have been added. The papery whisper tells me so. They are my pages, the account of the boy who stood his ground. My loneliness, my fear, my endless vigil. It is all there, another layer of pigment in the house, vast, grim canvas. Last Tuesday, my father died. It was a gentle passing in his sleep, the kind he deserved. My mother followed him 2 days later, not from illness, but from a quiet, decided brokenness. The house was finally, truly, still. The last bastion of ordinary life was gone. And in the silence they left behind, the house began to stir in a way I had not felt since I was 16. The light in the hall resumed its breathing last night. The pulse is different now, slower, more deliberate, like a heart regaining its strength after a long convalescence. The smell of dust and old paper is no longer confined to the closet. It permeates every room, a sweet, suffocating perfume. The wanderer is testing the new boundaries of our arrangement. With my parents gone, the balance has shifted. I am the only sustenance left. This morning, I went into the attic. The book was warm to the touch. I knew what I had to do. I am not my father who found solace in the past. I am not my mother who softened the world with color. I am the boy who saw the breathing light. I am the man who spoke to the void. I carried the book down to the living room, to the hearth where we once hung our stockings at Christmas. I laid it on the grate. I poured lamp oil over its cold, leathery cover. The spiral eye seemed to weep the black fluid. But as I struck the match, a cold certainty settled over me. Burning it would not destroy the story. It would only set the teller free. The wanderer would simply find another fragile soul, another old house, and begin its collection anew. My family's pain, my pain, would be for nothing. The page would turn, and the next chapter would begin somewhere else. I blew out the match. The smell of sulfur was sharp in my nose. I picked up the book, the oil soaking into my sleeve, and I held it against my chest. It was not a burden to be destroyed. It was a responsibility to be carried. This house is not a prison. It is a quarantine. I am its warden. The whispering has stopped. The only sound is the slow, tidal breath of the hall light, in and out, in and out. I sit in my father's old armchair, the book heavy on my lap. I am waiting. I am listening. I am the next page, and I am ready. The decision settled into my bones, a cold, heavy certainty. The book was not a curse to be broken, but a weight I was destined to bear. I stood, my legs stiff, and carried it from the living room, past the pulsing light in the hall, and into the small study my father had called his own. I cleared a space on his old oak desk, pushing aside his neatly labeled boxes of index cards. I placed the book there, right in the center. It belonged nowhere else. This would be my post. Days bled into weeks. The house, freed from the dampening presence of my parents' innocent belief, grew more vocal. The floorboards now creaked with a specific footstep-like cadence in the empty rooms upstairs. The smell of dust and decay would sometimes give way to a fleeting, familiar scent. My father's pipe tobacco, my mother's lily-of-the-valley perfume, a cruel trick, or perhaps just the house cycling through its collection of memories. I accepted it all. I did not react. I simply observed, a silent scholar of its haunting. My life became a ritual. I would sit at the desk for hours, my hands flat on the wood on either side of the book, neither opening it nor looking away. I was asserting my presence, my watchfulness. I was reminding the house, and the thing that curated it, that I was still here. And I still saw. The slow turn of a page in the walls would often come in response. A soft, dry answer to my unspoken challenge. Tonight, the rhythm changed. I was in the kitchen, making tea, when I heard it. Not a single page, but a flutter, a rapid succession of turns, like someone frantically searching for a specific passage. The pulse of the hall light quickened, matching the frantic rhythm. A wave of cold air washed down the corridor, carrying with it the sound of a child's stifled sob. So clear and so close it could have been right behind me. I set the kettle down, my hand steady, and walked toward the study. This was not a random occurrence. This was an invitation, or a summons. The door to the study was ajar. I always closed it. The book on the desk was open. I had not left it that way. The weak, tea-colored light from the hall spilled across the floor, but it did not reach the desk. A deeper darkness pooled there, a gloom that seemed to swallow the light whole. I stepped inside. The air was frigid and still. I looked down at the open pages. The jagged, blood-dark script was moving. It was not a trick of the light. The letters were uncurling, rearranging themselves, flowing into a new pattern, a new sentence written just for this moment. And this time, I could read it. The words formed in my mind as my eyes traced their shifting shape. It did not speak of the past. It spoke of the future. It described this very moment, me standing here, the chill in the air, the weight of the decision in my heart. It told me that a family was coming. A young couple with a quiet, dreamy child, a boy who saw faces in the wood grain. They were looking at houses. They would be drawn to this one. They would feel its charm, its history, its price. They would not sense the hunger. The writing stopped. The final sentence lay on the page, a stark and simple prophecy. I could let them come. They would feed the wanderer for a generation, their quiet sorrows and domestic disappointments adding new, rich chapters to the book. The pressure on me would ease. I could live out my life in a quieter house, a mere tenant instead of a warden. Or I could stop them. I could stand on the porch like a grim omen and warn them away. I would save them, but in doing so, I would bind myself to this house forever. There would be no one else to take my place. My loneliness would become the sole sustaining meal for the presence in the walls until the end of my days. The choice was mine. The story was not just being written, it was being offered. I reached out a single finger and touched the freshly inscribed words. The paper was ice cold, but beneath it, I felt a faint, sluggish warmth, like blood deep underground. I understood then that the book was not just a record. It was the heart, and I was being asked to become its keeper. I looked up from the page, toward the doorway where the shadows swelled and receded with the house's breath. I knew what I would do. The family would not come. This was my burden. This was my page, and I would fill it with my own quiet, defiant life, line by line, until the very end. I closed the book. The moment the cover shut, the frantic page turning on the walls ceased. The hall light's pulse slowed to a steady, almost weary rhythm. The cold retreated. It was done. The house had my answer. The next morning, I called the real estate agent and told her in no uncertain terms that the house was no longer for sale. I invented a sentimental attachment she found quaint but financially foolish. I didn't care. I walked through the quiet, empty rooms, no longer just a resident or a warden, but a component of the system itself. The house and I had reached a new equilibrium, a symbiotic relationship of shared solitude. I began to write, not in the book, never in the book, but in a simple lined notebook I bought from the pharmacy. I wrote down everything: the weather, the names of the birds at the feeder, memories of my parents that were warm and bright. I wrote of small, mundane joys, the taste of fresh coffee, the weight of a sunbeam on the floor. I filled the pages with the stubborn, ordinary prose of a life being lived. I would read these passages aloud sometimes, my voice a low, steady murmur in the silent house. I was not feeding it my sorrow. I was feeding it my presence. I was proving that a life could be lived within its walls without being consumed by despair. The years have passed. The family never came. The house is quiet, but it is not hungry. The whispers are faint, almost respectful. The hall light glows with a constant if dim light. The book on the desk remains closed. Sometimes, when I place my hand on its cover, I feel not a malevolent warmth, but a kind of acceptance, a dormant patience. It knows I will not be its next victim. I am its collaborator. I am an old man now. My hair is white. My hands are gnarled. I still live in the house. I still write in my notebooks, a stack of them now filling a shelf in the study. They are my counterspell, my bulwark of the mundane. This morning as I sat at the desk, a new sound joined the familiar symphony of creaks and sighs. It was a different whisper, softer, more hesitant than the dry rustle of pages. It came from the corner of the room, and for the first time in 60 years, it did not speak of the past. It spoke a single, clear word, a word that held no sorrow, no fear, but a simple, profound acknowledgement. It spoke my name, and in that moment, I understood the final terrible truth. I was not just the warden or the collaborator. I was becoming part of the collection, not as a tale of sorrow, but as a story of endurance. And when I am gone, my voice will join the whisper in the walls. A new, steady thread in the tapestry, a guardian spirit for this lonely, hungry place. The page turns and the story continues, but I have written my own line. And it was enough. The acknowledgement of my name did not frighten me. It felt instead like a key, turning in a lock deep within the house foundation. The dynamic shifted that day, not with a bang, but with a sigh of settling dust. The wanderer was no longer a predator I held at bay. It had become a colleague, a silent partner in the maintenance of this fragile world. We were two old souls in a vast, quiet building, bound by a shared purpose we could never speak aloud. My notebooks became our common ground. I began leaving them open on the desk beside the ancient book. I would return later to find a sentence subtly altered, a single word changed to something more precise, more beautiful. A description of a gray sky might be amended to a sky, the color of a sleeping pigeon's breast. My mundane chronicle was being edited, refined, turned into literature by an unseen hand. What? It was not a violation. It was a collaboration. The house was no longer just feeding on me. It was learning from me, and I from it. I learned the cadence of its silences, the meaning behind the different qualities of its light. I could tell a day of simple patience from a day of old, resurfacing pain. This morning, I found a fresh entry in my current notebook, in a script that was not my own. It was elegant and spidery, written in an ink that looked like diluted sepia. It described the way the dawn light struck the dewy spiderwebs on the rose bushes outside the kitchen window, a sight I had witnessed just an hour before. It was a perfect, poignant observation. I felt a strange, quiet pride, as if a brilliant, troubled student had finally completed an assignment. The house was not just recording sorrow anymore. It was recording beauty, the quiet, resilient beauty of a life endured. My life. I'm very tired now. The winter is deep, and the cold seeps into my bones in a way it never used to. I sit in my father's armchair, a rug over my knees, and watch the hall light. It is steady, a soft, golden glow. There are no more whispers, only a profound and watchful silence. I know my time is short. The thought is not terrifying. It feels like a natural conclusion, the final sentence in a long and complicated paragraph. I have left instructions. The house is to be donated to a historical society under a strict covenant that it never be sold, never be truly lived in again. It is to be a museum, open by appointment only, a place for the occasional curious visitor to feel a faint, inexplicable chill and see a strangely persistent light in the hall. They will never know the truth. They will only feel the echo. I close my eyes. The darkness behind my lids is warm and welcoming. I can feel it now, not as a malevolent force, but as a presence settling around me, like a well-worn cloak. There is no fear, only a final, deep understanding. I am not being collected. I am being welcomed home. My story will not be one of sorrow in the great book, but one of guardianship. A tale of the man who stayed. The light in the hall seems to brighten, just for a moment, and then everything is still. The last page turns, not with a rustle, but with the soft, final sound of a breath being released. And then there is only the quiet waiting house. The quiet did not last. It never does. A new sound began, faint at first, like the scratch of a pen nib on vellum. It was not coming from the walls or the attic, but from the study. I rose from the chair, my old bones protesting, and walked to the desk. The book was open. The sepia script was flowing once more, but this time it was not recording the past or the present. It was writing the future. It described a researcher, a woman with a quiet intensity and a fascination for forgotten places, who would discover the covenant and the strange stories surrounding the house. She would not be dreamy or fragile. She would be driven, her own history a tangled knot of loss and academic obsession. She would be the perfect new anchor, her strong but wounded spirit a feast for the waiting silence. I watched the words form, a cold dread seeping through my weariness. My lifetime of vigilance, my sacrifice, had only been an intermission. The story was not over. It was simply preparing for its next protagonist. The house had learned from me, adapted. It no longer sought the easily broken. It sought the intriguingly complex. I reached out a trembling hand, not to stop the script, but to feel the paper one last time. It was warm, almost feverish with anticipation. I had failed. The quarantine was broken, but as I stood there, a final, defiant thought crystallized in my mind. I turned from the book and took the latest volume from my stack of notebooks. I opened it to a blank page, and with my last reserves of strength, I began to write. I did not write of beauty or endurance. I wrote a warning. I wrote of the breathing light, the whispering walls, the exact nature of the hunger that lived here. I named the Wanderer. I described our collaboration not as a triumph, but as a stalemate that had now reached its end. I wrote it all down, in clear, plain prose. Then I closed the notebook and placed it squarely on top of the ancient book, a single, mundane barrier over the glowing, malevolent text. I returned to my chair. The scratching from the study had stopped. The house was holding its breath. I had not stopped the story, but I had introduced a new variable, a seed of doubt, a piece of the truth, left in plain sight for the next curious soul. It was the only weapon I had left. I closed my eyes as the hall light began to pulse again, slowly at first, then faster. A frantic, angry rhythm in the deepening dark. The story was continuing, but I had written my own ending. And somewhere, in the silence between the heartbeats of the light, I thought I heard, for the very first time, a sound that was not a whisper, not a turning page, but a soft, frustrated sigh. The frantic pulse of the light lasted until dawn. With the first gray streaks of morning, it slowed, settling into a sullen, simmering rhythm. The house felt different. The collaboration was over. I had broken our unspoken treaty. I was no longer a colleague. I was, once again, a problem. I did not go into the study. I could feel the book there, a low thrum of displeasure emanating from under the cover of my notebook. My warning was a stone in its shoe, a splinter in its mind. It could not ignore it, and it could not remove it without acknowledging the truth of my words. I had forced a kind of honesty upon it. Days turned into a tense, silent standoff. The familiar smells faded, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone, as if after a lightning strike. The floorboards no longer creaked with the memory of footsteps, but groaned under a weight that was purely present, a constant physical pressure. The house was no longer trying to charm or collect. It was simply waiting for me to die. My body, already at its limit, began to fail more rapidly. The climb up the stairs became a monumental effort. The cold sank deeper into my lungs. I knew the end was near, but a strange peace settled over me. I had done what I could. I had not saved myself, but I had perhaps given the next soul a fighting chance. This evening, as I sat in my chair watching the light, I saw it. A flicker at the edge of my vision, a coalescence of shadow in the hallway. It was not a memory or a whisper. It was a form, tall and indistinct, a man-shaped void that drank the light from the air around it. The Wanderer. It had never shown itself to me before. It stood there, at the periphery of the living room, a silent testament to my transgression. It did not move toward me. It simply watched. And in that watching, I felt not hatred, but a cold, ancient curiosity. I was an anomaly it had not anticipated, a story that had rewritten its own ending. I met its gaze, or the space where a gaze would be. I felt no fear, only a profound weariness. The form remained for a long moment, and then it dissolved, not fading, but unwinding, like a spool of black thread, its essence pulling back into the walls, into the floors, into the very heart of the house. The hall light steadied, burning with a cold, clear, and utterly lonely flame. I took one last, shallow breath. The air was still and sharp. My work was done. The final page of my story was not written in the ancient book, nor was it whispered in the walls. It was here, in this quiet, defiant end. I closed my eyes and let the silence claim me. The house was ready for its next guest, but it would never again have one like me. The silence that followed my passing was not the true silence of an empty building. It was a held breath, a pause in the narrative. The house absorbed my final moments, the stubborn piece of my exit, and found it was a flavor it could not easily categorize. It was not the rich despair it craved, nor the bright joy it rejected. It was something else, something that left a residue of quiet unease. The light in the hall remained steady, a cold, constant vigil. The book in the study lay under my notebook, the weight of my plane, warning words a cage for the malevolent text beneath. For a time, nothing happened. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams that slanted through the dirty windows. Seasons turned unseen beyond the walls. Then, a key turned in the front door. The Historical Society had sent a representative, a young man tasked with the initial assessment of the property. He was pragmatic, armed with a clipboard and a digital camera, his mind on dry rot and property taxes. He felt the chill, of course, and noted the persistent light in the hall with a frown, checking the wiring diagram on his papers. He was an unsuitable candidate, his soul armored with bureaucracy and modern skepticism. The house barely stirred for him. He found my notebook on the desk, read a few lines of my warning, and smirked, dismissing it as the ramblings of a reclusive old man. He placed it in a cardboard box with other non-historical artifacts destined for disposal, but he did not touch the book beneath it. Something about the feel of its cover, cold and faintly repellent like old skin, made him leave it right where it was. He left, locking the door behind him, and the house settled back into its waiting. Months passed. The researcher arrived. She was exactly as the book had foretold, driven, intense, her eyes sharp with an intelligence that had been honed on personal tragedy. She had lost a brother to a long illness, and her study of forgotten places was a search for echoes, for proof that something persists. She was not dreamy, but she was profoundly, dangerously receptive. She felt the house's presence immediately. It was not a chill to her, but a resonance. She stood in the hallway, ignoring the real estate agent's prattle, and listened to the silence. She heard the faint, dry rustle, not as a threat, but as a welcome. The house, sensing her quality, began its work. It showed her a fleeting glimpse of a young man in a vintage army uniform, standing at the top of the stairs, a memory of a long-lost son from a previous family, offered as a lure. She gasped, not in fear, but in validation. She spent her first evening alone in the house, as per the Covenant's allowance for academic study. She found the book. She opened it. The sepia script began to flow for her, telling her a story tailored to her wounds. A tale of a spirit unable to move on, a brother lost not to disease, but to the shadows of this very home. It was a lie, a beautiful, tragic lie, and she embraced it. She was ready to feed it with her own sophisticated grief. As she bent over the page, enthralled, her elbow knocked against the cardboard box left by the Historical Society. My notebook, forgotten at the bottom, slid out and fell to the floor, falling open to the page where I had written my warning. Her eyes, flicking down them from the book's hypnotic script, caught a few of my words. The breathing light, the whispering walls, the exact nature of the hunger. She paused. The book's narrative wavered. It was a single moment of doubt, the tiny crack I had hoped to create. She looked from the beautiful tragic script in the book, to the blunt, blocky letters of my handwriting. She looked up at the hall light, which was now pulsing with a soft, inviting rhythm. But now, she also saw the pulse for what it might be. A heartbeat. A lure. She did not run. She was a researcher. She slowly closed the ancient book, placing my notebook on top of it, just as I had. The house held its breath. The story had been interrupted. The ending was not yet written. She sat down in my father's old armchair, the very one I had died in. And she waited, watching the light, listening to the whispers that were now tinged not with sorrow, but with a faint, rising frustration. The game had changed. The new player had read the rules left by the old one, and the house, for the first time in centuries, felt a flicker of something it could not control. The story would continue, but it would never again be the same. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair, my notebook open on her lap, and read it from cover to cover under the glow of a single battery-powered lantern. She read about the taste of my coffee, the weight of the sunbeams, my theory of the mundane as a counterspell. She read my final, desperate warning. She was not frightened. She was fascinated. This was not the ghost story she had come to find. This was a manual. When dawn came, her mind was clear. She packed her things, but she did not leave. She went into town and returned with supplies. A camp stove, a sleeping bag, a ream of fresh, cheap notebooks, and a new, heavy-duty lock for the front door. She was not moving in. Not exactly. She was beginning a vigil. She set up her own desk opposite the one that held the book. She ignored the ancient volume, leaving my notebook as its paperweight. She began to write. She did not write of lost brothers or spectral soldiers. She wrote field notes. She described the quality of the silence, the temperature fluctuations, the specific frequency of the hall light's pulse. She was deconstructing the haunting, turning it into data. She was, in her own way, building her own bulwark of the mundane. The house reacted with a slow, building fury. The whispers returned, no longer seductive, but sharp and sibilant, like tearing paper. The temperature would plummet in the room she was in. Shadows would mass in the corners, thick and oily. Once, a vase of wildflowers she had picked shattered on the mantelpiece, scattering shards and petals across the floor. She noted it all down. Subject demonstrates capacity for poltergeist-like phenomena when its primary narrative is rejected. A sign of frustration, not strength. Days turned into weeks. She was growing thin, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep, but her resolve was iron. She was fighting the house, not with fear or fascination, but with clinical observation. She was starving it of the emotional engagement it required. One evening, as she wrote, the hall light went out completely, plunging the hallway into absolute blackness. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, a physical pressure on the eardrums. She looked up from her notes, her pen still. This was new. From the darkness of the hall, the wanderer emerged. It did not flicker at the edge of her vision this time. It stepped fully into the doorway of the study, a solid figure of concentrated shadow, its form bleeding the light from her lantern. It was the most direct manifestation it had ever attempted. She did not scream. She slowly placed her pen down on her notebook and looked at it, her head tilted in that same academic curiosity. "It won't work," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "I've read the previous warden's notes. I understand the mechanism. You can't have my story, not the way you want it." The form seemed to ripple. The air grew so cold her breath plumed in the lamplight. It took a step forward. She stood her ground. "You can try to break me, but it will just be another data point. Another entry in the log. He proved you could be lived with. I will prove you can be documented. You will become a case study. A specimen. The shadow halted. The furious cold abated, just a degree. The hall light flickered once, weakly, then died again. The figure of the wanderer began to recede, not with a dramatic vanish, but by slowly unraveling, its substance dissipating like smoke until there was only the empty doorway and the oppressive dark. She let out a long, shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She picked up her pen. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote the latest entry. Direct visual confrontation with the core manifestation, designated the Wanderer. Subject appears to respond to a complete denial of its narrative framework. It retreated upon the assertion of its status as a specimen. Hypothesis. Its power is contingent on its mystery, on its ability to craft a story. When its story is refused, it is left with only brute force. She looked up at the dark hallway, then back at the ancient book, still silenced under the weight of my words. It's just you and me now, she whispered to the waiting house. And we are going to have a very long, very boring conversation. The house was silent. It had no reply. The new warden had begun her watch, and her story was one it did not know how to read. Story 2. The first thing Jonas Ray felt was the cold. It was not the clean, sharp cold of a winter morning, but a deep mineral dampness that had seeped into the very grain of the wood beneath his cheek. He was on the floor of his own kitchen, and the wide plank pine, which he had sanded and sealed with Christina just 2 summers ago, felt like the skin of something long buried. He pushed himself up, his palms flat against the unforgiving surface, and a shudder racked his frame, a convulsion that started in his spine and rattled his teeth. His head was a cathedral of pain, a ringing, hollow ache centered just above his temples. He raised a hand, fingers trembling, and touched his own brow. Where there should have been only the familiar curve of bone and the soft give of skin, he found something else. Something hard. Something that spiraled out from his skull, rough and ridged like the bark of a young oak, tapering to a dull, insistent point. He traced the shape, his heart a frantic bird against his ribs, following it down to where it emerged, tender and impossibly rooted from his own flesh. There was another, a mirror image, on the other side. He scrambled to his feet, his legs unsteady, and stumbled to the small tarnished mirror hanging by the back door. The man who stared back was Jonas Ray, but it was a version of him carved by a cruel and unfamiliar hand. His face was pale, smudged with the shadows of a sleepless night he could not remember. His eyes, usually a quiet, thoughtful blue, were now the color of a storm-laden sea, and they held a light he did not recognize. And from his forehead, just where his hairline began its retreat, grew 2 horns. They were not the grand, branching antlers of a stag, nor the twisted, demonic spires of a church gargoyle. They were simpler, more primal, like the horns of a young bull or a desert ram, curving upward and outwards with a terrible organic finality. They were the color of old bone, streaked with fine, dark lines like veins of ore. They were part of him. A sound escaped his throat, not a scream, but a dry, rattling gasp. He gripped the edges of the sink, the porcelain cold against his palms, and stared at the aberration. Christina's face, smiling from a photograph stuck to the corner of the mirror, seemed to mock him. Her laughter, which had once filled this kitchen, was now a ghost in the silence. Her absence was a hole in the world, a void that had, it seemed, summoned this change in him. This was her fault. Not her, but the fact of her being gone. The cancer that had eaten her from the inside had left behind this hollow man, this thing with horns, as if her death had been a fertilizer for some monstrous new growth within him. He had to get out. He snatched a faded baseball cap from a hook, pulling it low over his brow. The rough fabric of the brim, a constant shameful pressure against the new protrusions. The outside world was drenched in the pale, watery light of an autumn morning. Hemlock Grove, his town, lay nestled in a valley, a collection of clapboard houses and brick storefronts that seemed to huddle together for warmth against the encroaching woods. The air smelled of wood smoke and decaying leaves. It was a normal Tuesday. He walked, head down, towards the town square, a place he had known every crack and contour of since childhood. His first encounter was with Mrs. Albright, who was arranging pumpkins on the steps of her general store. She was a woman in her 70s, her face a roadmap of kindly wrinkles. "Morning, Jonas Ray," she said, her voice as familiar as the sound of the creek. You feeling all right, dear?" He mumbled something, trying to sidestep her. But as he drew closer, her smile faltered. Her eyes, behind their thick lenses, lost their focus. They seemed to look through him at something else entirely. Her mouth opened, and a different voice emerged, thin and reedy. A secret voice kept locked in a dusty box. "I put arsenic in the stray cat's milk," she whispered, the words devoid of emotion. "The one with the mangled ear, it kept crying under my window. It kept crying and I just wanted to sleep. I just wanted it to be quiet." She blinked, and the kindness flooded back into her face, a mask perfectly reset. "You take care now here," she said, as if nothing had happened. Jonas Ray stood frozen, the words echoing in the new hollow spaces of his mind. He backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was the horns. They did not grant him mind-reading, not exactly. They were a key, turning a lock in the air between him and others, opening a door to the rot festering just beneath the surface of their lives. He was a dowsing rod for truth, a lightning rod for sin. He found his childhood friend, Carmelo, at the old train depot, now a gutted shell where they used to drink stolen beer and talk about their futures. Carmelo was leaning against the rusted tracks, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold. He was the town sheriff, a position that had once seemed like a punchline, but now fit him with a grim authority. He saw Jonas Ray, and a flicker of something, worry, pity, fear, crossed his face before it settled into a neutral, professional mask. "Jonas," Carmelo said, his voice careful. "Heard you hadn't been around after, I'm sorry, man. I should have come by." Jonas Ray stopped a few feet away, the cap pulled low. "I've been unwell." Carmelo took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "What's with the hat? It's 50 degrees out." And then it happened again. Carmelo's gaze went distant, fixed on the horns Jonas Ray knew he could not see, but could somehow sense. The sheriff's jaw tightened. His voice, when it came, was low and thick with a confession he never intended to make. "I was the one who found her car," he said, the words forced out of him. "After the doctor's appointment. The one where they said there was nothing more they could do. She was just sitting there in the driver's seat crying, not making a sound. Just tears. I told her it would be okay. I lied. I knew it wouldn't. I knew she was going to die. And I was glad it wasn't me." He shuddered, his eyes clearing. "Jonas, you're still with me." Jonas Ray felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This was not the grand betrayal he had been unconsciously searching for, but it was a crack, a fissure in the foundation of their friendship. It was a small human cruelty, all the more horrifying for its banality. "Yeah," Jonas Ray said, his own voice a stranger's. "I'm with you." He began to walk through the town like a ghost, a plague carrier of unwanted veracity. The postman confessed to stealing pension checks. The baker admitted to using his wife's inheritance to cover his debts. The high school sweethearts, now a middle-aged couple arguing outside the bank, suddenly turned their venom on each other, spouting truths about infidelities and resentments they had buried for decades. The town's pristine surface, the one Jonas Ray had known his whole life, was peeling away like old paint, revealing the crawling phosphorescent rot beneath. The horns were a curse, but they were also a lens, and through them, Hemlock Grove was a festering wound of a place. He retreated to the empty house, to the silence that was now a chorus of Christina's absence. He stood before the mirror again, and took off the hat. The horns seemed larger now, more a part of him. He remembered the final days, the hospital room smell of antiseptic and decay, the way her hand had felt in his, so light, like a bundle of twigs. He remembered the desperation, the prayers to a God he didn't believe in, the silent, screaming deals he tried to make with the universe. Take me instead. Let her live. He had poured every ounce of his love, his fear, his rage into that void. And the void, it seemed, had answered. It had not given her back. It had made him into this instrument of its own bleak honesty. The search for the one responsible for his loss was no longer a search for a person. It was a search for a reason, for a source of this metaphysical infection. He drove out to the old quarry on the edge of town, a place of deep black water and sheer rock faces. It was where kids went to get into trouble, where secrets were whispered and lost to the echoing cliffs. He stood at the precipice, the wind whipping at his clothes, and he screamed her name into the void. Christina! The wind stole the sound, but the horn seemed to vibrate with the force of it, and the quarry gave him an answer, not in words, but in a wave of feeling, a psychic backlash from the town behind him. He saw, not with his eyes, but with the new sense the horns had given him, the collective weight of Hemlock Grove's sorrow, a tapestry of grief, of loss, of quiet despair, lost children, lost loves, lost hopes. He had not been singled out. His pain was just one thread in a vast, dark fabric. The thing that had changed him was not a demon or a god, but the town itself, the accumulated grief of generations, using him as a focal point, a vent for its poisoned soul. He was not cursed by an external force. He was the town's grief, made flesh and bone and horn. He returned to town a different man. The cap was gone. He walked down the main street, the horns exposed for all to see. People did not scream or run. They simply confessed. As he passed, their hidden shames, their petty cruelties, their deepest regrets, spilled from their lips in a susurrating chorus. He was the truth, and they could not look away. He found Carmelo outside the sheriff's office, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Jonas, you need to stop this," Carmelo said, his voice strained. The air between them crackled with the unspoken. "Why?" Jonas Ray's voice was calm, resonant. The pain in his head was gone, replaced by a terrible, clear certainty. "You were glad it wasn't you. You were glad my wife was dying and not you. Say it to me, Carmelo. Say it to my face." Carmelo's face contorted. He fought it, his knuckles white where he gripped the pistol. But the power of the horns was a tide he could not withstand. "I was glad," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "I saw her, and I thought of Beth and my kids. And I was so glad it was her and not me. Forgive me, Jonas. Forgive me." Jonas Ray looked at his friend, broken and weeping on the sidewalk. There was no anger left in him, only a vast, cosmic pity. He reached out and laid a hand on Carmelo's shoulder. The contact was electric. Carmelo flinched, but did not pull away. And in that touch, Jonas Ray did not draw out another truth. Instead, he pushed one in. He showed Carmelo the vision from the quarry, the endless shared grief of the town, the beautiful, terrible truth of their interconnected sorrow. He showed him that his small human relief was not a sin, but a part of the whole. Carmelo sank to his knees, sobbing, not in shame, but in a kind of awful, transcendent understanding. Jonas Ray walked on, leaving his friend there. He went to the little cemetery on the hill where Christina was buried. The earth over her grave was still raw. He knelt, the damp soil soaking through the knees of his jeans. He placed his hands, palms down, on the mound. He could feel the cold, the finality of it. He could feel the intricate branching network of roots from the ancient oak that shaded her plot. He could feel the worms, the stones, the slow, patient settling of the earth. And then he pushed deeper. He pushed past the soil, past the wood of the coffin, with all the force of his newfound being, with all of the power the horns and the town's grief had given him. He was not seeking a confession from her. He was seeking an answer from the silence itself. He found it. It was not a voice, not a vision. It was a presence, vast, cold, and ancient. It was the consciousness of the valley, the spirit of the place they called Hemlock Grove. It was not evil. It was simply old, and it fed on the emotions of the things that lived upon it. Joy was a fleeting spice, but sorrow was a rich, deep wine. Christina's death, his own profound, rending grief, had been a feast. The horns were not a curse or a gift. They were a symbiosis. He was the antenna, and the town, the land, was the broadcaster. He would live a long, long time, he knew. He would be the town's heart, its confessor, the living monument to its sorrow. He stood up. The sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows from the tombstones. He looked down at the grave one last time, and then he turned and walked back towards the lights of the town below. He did not walk like a man defeated, nor like a monster. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a new function in the world, a necessary, terrible part of the order of things. He would go home. He would live in the house he had shared with her. He would walk the streets, and the people would speak their secrets to him, and in doing so, they would find a strange, painful kind of peace. He's their punishment and their absolution, and in the deep, quiet places of the earth, beneath the roots of the oldest trees and the foundations of the oldest houses, the thing that was the valley settled back to watch its new heart beat, and to wait for the next great sorrow, and the one after that, and the one after that, forever and ever. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the low hum of the town's unspoken life, a constant, whispering pressure against his skull. He learned to filter it, to let it become a background noise, like the rush of a distant river. Days bled into weeks. He stopped going to the grocery store. Mrs. Albright would leave a box of essentials on his porch, her face averted, her secret about the cat now a shared quiet burden between them. People who did not visit. They did not call. His presence was a necessary, uncomfortable sacrament. He spent his days in the woods that bordered the town, walking for hours. The trees did not confess. The truth was simpler, a cycle of growth and decay that held no malice. The horns, he discovered, did not work on things that had no capacity for deceit. A fox was a fox. A stone was a stone. It was only the human heart, with its labyrinth of lies and justifications, that resonated with his new nature. One evening, a young woman came to his door. Her name was Lila, and she was new to Hemlock Grove, a painter who had rented the old Miller place. She had heard the stories, of course, the whispers of the man with the horns who pulled the truth from you. She stood on his porch, her hands shoved into the pockets of her paint-splattered jacket, her gaze direct and unafraid. "I'm not here to confess," she said, her voice clear. "I just wanted to see you for myself." Jonas Ray stood in the doorway, the warmth of the house bleeding out into the cold night. He felt the usual pressure building, the instinct of the horns to pry, to find the hidden thing. But with her, it was different. There was a stillness. He gestured for her to enter. She walked into his kitchen, her eyes taking in the simple, lonely state of the place. She did not look at the horns with fear or morbid curiosity, but with the assessing eye of an artist. "They have a good shape," she said. "A strong line." He almost laughed. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged them as anything but a horror. They sat at the kitchen table, and she told him about her work, about the light in the valley, how it was different here, thicker. She spoke of her own past, her move from the city, her desire for quiet. She offered these things freely. The horns remained silent, because she was speaking only truth. Then she paused, looking down at her hands. "There is one thing," she said. "It's not a secret. Not really. But it's a sadness. I had a sister. She died when we were teenagers. A car accident." No. The pressure in his head intensified, but it was not the sharp, invasive probe for a hidden sin. It was a softer resonance, a tuning fork vibrating to a note of pure, unadulterated grief. He saw it, not as a forced confession, but as an image she was willingly sharing. Two girls laughing, a flash of metal, a long silence. "I think that's why I came here," Lila said, looking up at him. "I heard that you understand sorrow." And he did. In that moment, he was not a scourge or a confessor. He was simply a man in a quiet kitchen, sharing a cup of tea with another lonely soul. The horns were quiet. The valley's hunger was sated for now by this simple, honest exchange. He knew this peace was temporary. The town's rot was deep, and it would call to him again. But as he sat with Lila, in the warm pool of lamplight, he understood that his function was not only to expose the poison, but to sometimes, just sometimes, bear witness to the pain without judgment. It was a small thing, but in the endless, grim tapestry of Hemlock Grove, it felt like a single, stubborn stitch of light. He walked her to the door when the moon was high, a sliver of bone in the black sky. She did not say goodbye, only nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. After she left, the house did not feel as empty. It felt waiting. The next day, he did not put on the hat. He walked to the town square and sat on a bench near the war memorial. It was not an act of aggression, but of presence. He was a feature of the landscape now, as natural and unsettling as the dark pines that gave the town its name. People avoided looking directly at him, but they did not cross the street. They went about their business, and as they passed, their secrets came. A soft, relentless drizzle of human frailty. A businessman muttered about embezzling funds. A teenager whispered the cruel nickname she had for her mother. A priest, his color stark white in the gloom, confessed under his breath to the sin of disbelief. Jonas Ray did not react. He simply absorbed it, a living filter for the town's spiritual pollution dawn. The confessions washed over him, through him, and into the ground beneath his feet, feeding the ancient, hungry thing that slept below. Later, Carmelo found him there. He looked older, the encounter on the sidewalk having carved new lines around his eyes. He sat on the bench, leaving a careful foot of space between them. "Leela," Carmelo said. Not a question, but a statement. "She's asking questions. Normal ones. About the town's history. No one does that." Jonas Ray watched a leaf detach from a sycamore and spiral down. "She's an artist. She's curious." "Curiosity is dangerous here," Carmelo replied, his voice low. "You know that better than anyone. This place, it doesn't like to be looked at too closely. It prefers to do the looking." "Come." They sat in silence for a long time. Two men bound by a shared, terrible knowledge. The unspoken truth hung between them. Carmelo's relief, Jonas Ray's forgiveness. It was a new foundation, cracked and uneven, but it was all they had. "Beth wants to have you over for dinner," Carmelo said finally, the words sounding foreign and fragile. "She says you shouldn't be alone in that house." The invitation was a spark of startling, ordinary kindness. It felt like a memory from another life. Jonas Ray knew it was a risk. His presence at their family table could unleash any number of hidden resentments or fears. But he also knew that the valley's hunger was cyclical, and for now, it was quiet. "All right," he said. "Tell her I'll come." Carmelo nodded, stood up, and walked away, his shoulders a little less burdened. Jonas Ray remained on the bench as the afternoon light began to fail. He thought of Christina, not with the sharp, lancing pain of fresh grief, but with a deep, enduring ache, like an old wound that had become part of his structure. He was the town's grief, yes, but he was also his own. The two were inseparable now. He looked towards the woods, towards the dark line of hemlocks. He could feel the presence there, vast and patient. It was not his master, and he was not its slave. They were partners in a grim, eternal dance. He stood, the bones of his body feeling both heavy and weightless, and turned towards home. The confessional of the streets was closed for the day. For a few hours, he would just be a man, walking through the cooling air, holding on to the faint, impossible hope of a normal dinner. The horns on his head were a part of him, and he was a part of the town, and the town was a part of the darkness, and the darkness was waiting. It could wait a little longer. The dinner was a quiet, strained affair. Beth had made a roast, the kind of meal she would have brought over when Christina was first sick, and the familiar smell of it filled the small dining room with a painful nostalgia. Carmelo's children, a boy and a girl, stared at Jonas Ray's horns with a mixture of fear and fascination. But they said nothing, disciplined by an unspoken parental warning. Beth kept the conversation flowing with a desperate, cheerful energy, talking about school plays and a new recipe she had tried. It was a performance of normalcy, and everyone was playing their part. Jonas Ray felt the pressure building behind his eyes. He could feel the seams of their family life, the small, careful lies that held it together. He felt Beth's quiet resentment over the long hours Carmelo worked, and Carmelo's gnawing fear that he was a disappointment to his father. They were ordinary marital tensions, the kind that existed in every home. But here, in this town, they felt magnified, feeding the subtle current of unease in the room. He focused on his plate, on the taste of the food, on the simple act of chewing and swallowing, using the physical sensations as an anchor. After the children were excused, Beth brought out coffee. Her smile finally faltered. She looked from Jonas Ray to her husband and then back again. "I don't pretend to understand what's happened to you, Jonas," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But this town, it's sick, and I think you're the fever. A fever burns out an infection." Carmelo shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Beth." "No, let me finish," she said, her gaze fixed on Jonas Ray. "People are talking, really talking. Not just the ugly stuff, but real things. My mother called me yesterday. For the first time in 10 years, she apologized for the things she said when I married Carmelo." Her eyes glistened. "It's horrible and it's brutal, but there's a strange kind of cleaning happening. Maybe that's what you are." Her words settled over him. A fever. Not a monster, not a savior, but a symptom and a purge. It was the most honest assessment of his condition he had yet heard, and it hadn't been torn from her by the horns. She had offered it freely. For a moment, the humming in his head ceased, replaced by a profound and startling silence. He walked home under a canopy of cold, bright stars. The house welcomed him back, the whispering pressure returning as soon as he crossed the threshold. But it felt different now, less like an assault and more like a mantle he had chosen to wear. He went to the window and looked out at the sleeping town. Pinpricks of light dotted the darkness, each one a house containing its own universe of secret joys and sorrows. He was connected to all of them, a central node in a web of truth. He knew Lila was right. The valley fed on sorrow, and it had made him its instrument. He knew Beth was right, that he was a fever, burning through the lies. But he was also just a man who missed his wife. That, perhaps, was the deepest truth of all, the one the horns could never expose because it was never hidden. It was the bedrock upon which everything else was built. He would sleep, and in the morning he would walk back out into the town, and the people would confess, and he would listen. It was his purpose. It was his penance. It was his life. The valley watched, and it was satisfied. The next morning, a delegation was waiting for him on his porch. It was led by Old Man Hemlock, the town's namesake. A man so weathered he seemed more like a feature of the land than a person. He was flanked by Mrs. Albright and the priest Jonas Ray had seen in the square. They did not look afraid. They looked resolved. Hemlock spoke, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. The dreams have changed. They're clearer now. The thing beneath us is dreaming of you. It's always dreamed of us, but now we're dreaming back. We see the network, the roots. We see you at the center. He gestured to the horns. We understand now. They're not for you. They're for us. They're a conduit. Mrs. Albright stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly. My cat, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I told everyone it ran away, but I knew it was sick. I was too scared of the vet bill, of the pain. I put it in a pillowcase and I drowned it in the creek. I've carried that for 15 years. She looked at him, her eyes pleading not for forgiveness, but for acknowledgement. It's easier to carry now, since I told you. The priest simply nodded, a silent admission that his crisis of faith had passed, replaced by a colder, stranger certainty. They weren't there to ask him to stop. They were there to acknowledge his role. They were the congregation, and he was their living altar. The balance of power had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. He was not a pariah to be endured, but a function to be accepted. He descended the porch steps and walked past them, and they fell into step behind him. A quiet, somber procession. Others joined as he moved through the streets, not confessing, but simply walking with him. They were the ones who had already been cleansed, their secrets given to the man with the horns, and through him to the hungry earth. They were lighter now, but they were also bound to him, and to the truth of the place they called home. He led them to the edge of the quarry. The water was black and still. He could feel the presence below, not sleeping but watching, waiting to see what he would do with this newfound quiet authority. He turned and faced them, the small crowd of his townspeople. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The horns on his head were a silent sermon. He was their grief, and their truth, and their reckoning. And he was just getting started. The silence at the quarry was not empty. It was thick with shared understanding. No one demanded a speech. No one asked for a miracle. They simply stood with him at the precipice, looking into the dark water that reflected nothing. Then, one by one, they turned and walked back to their lives, their steps a little slower, their postures a little straighter. The burden had not vanished, but it had been redistributed. It was now a communal weight. Jonas Ray did not return home. He walked to Lila's rented house. She was in the front yard, setting up an easel. She saw him coming and paused, a tube of paint in her hand. She did not look at the small crowd dispersing behind him. She looked only at him. They're following you now, she said. It wasn't a question. They're following themselves, he replied. I'm just the path they're walking on. She considered this, then nodded. I dreamed of roots last night. thick, black roots pushing up through the floorboards. They were warm. She squeezed a serpentine line of green onto her palette. "I'm going to paint it. Is that all right?" He almost smiled. "I don't think you need my permission." "Everything here needs your permission now," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "That's what this is, isn't it? A new agreement." He left her to her work and continued his walk. The town felt different. The air was clearer, the edges of the buildings sharper. The constant hum of secrets had diminished, replaced by a low, resonant thrum of acceptance. People still glanced his way, but their eyes held less fear and more of a weary recognition. He was a fact. A law of nature, like the coming of winter. That afternoon, a man he didn't know approached him outside the post office. He was young, his face pale and strained. "My name's David," he said, his voice cracking. "I think I need to speak." Jonas Ray simply waited. He no longer had to actively pull the truth. It rose to meet him like water finding its own level. "It's about the Henderson boy," David blurted out, his eyes wide with a terrified relief. "The one who went missing last fall. We were fighting over a girl. It was an accident. He fell. I was so scared. I hid the body in the old mine shaft." He crumpled to his knees on the pavement, sobbing. Jonas Ray felt the truth settle into him, a cold, hard stone. He also felt the valley shift, a deep, subterranean sigh of satisfaction. This was a richer, darker vintage than a drowned cat or a stolen 20. This was the kind of sorrow that would feed the land for a season. He didn't touch the weeping man. He didn't offer comfort or condemnation. He just stood there, a silent witness, until the sheriff, who had been watching from his cruiser, slowly got out and walked over. He had heard everything. The whole street had. The truth, once spoken to the man with the horns, became public property. Jonas Ray walked away as the sheriff helped David to his feet. His work was done. The town would process this new, painful truth on its own. He was the catalyst, not the judge. He was the fever, and the infection was being burned away. One terrible, liberating confession at a time. The horns felt heavy, but they also felt right. This was his place. This was his purpose. And he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than bone, that there were many more truths to come. The Henderson boy's confession changed the weather in the town. It was as if a long-held breath had been released. A collective tension that had strangled the place for months, finally snapping. There was grief, of course, a fresh wave of it for the boy's family, but it was a clean grief, untainted by the poison of not knowing. The old mine shaft was searched, the remains recovered. A funeral was planned. The town moved through these motions with a solemn, weary efficiency. Jonas Ray kept to the edges of it all. He was the spark, not the fire. He watched from his bench as the town square filled with people bringing casseroles and condolences to the Henderson house. He saw the way they now looked at him, not with outright hostility, but with a kind of fearful respect. He was a necessary evil, a sharp tool used for a grim task. Lila found him there as the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows from the war memorial. She carried a canvas under her arm, covered with a cloth. "It's finished," she said without preamble. She pulled the cloth away. He expected a dark, chaotic mess of roots and sorrow. Instead, the painting was almost serene. It depicted the quarry at dawn, the water a sheet of pale, misty gray. And rising from the center of the water, intertwined and stark against the light, were two sets of antlers. They were not his, exactly. They were larger, more like the branches of a great submerged tree breaking the surface. The water around them was perfectly still, reflecting a sky that was just beginning to lighten. "It's not what I dreamed," she said, studying his reaction. "It's what I felt after. It's the quiet after the truth." Now, he looked from the painting to her face. She was not afraid of what he was, and she was not in awe of it. She was documenting it, an archaeologist of the spirit. In her own way, she was just as much a part of the valley's new equilibrium as he was. "They'll want you to leave, you know," he said, his voice low. "The Hendersons. Others. Now that the big secret is out, they'll think the job is done. They'll want to go back to forgetting. But we can't, can we?" Lila replied, covering the painting again. "You can't unbreak the bone. It either heals crooked or it heals strong." That night, the dream came to him. It was not the usual cacophony of other people's hidden shames. It was a single, powerful vision. He was standing in the woods, in a small clearing he recognized as the place he had first kissed Christina. But the trees were different. They were hemlocks, their branches heavy and dark. And from every branch, like strange fruit, hung small, glowing orbs of light. As he watched, one of the orbs dimmed and went out, and he felt a corresponding pang of loss, sharp and personal. Then another orb, right beside it, flared brighter, and he felt a surge of warmth, of hope. He understood. They were not just secrets. They were souls. The entire town connected, a constellation of light and shadow. And he was standing at the center of the grove, the roots of the trees tangling around his feet, the branches weaving through his horns. He was not just a confessor. He was the grove itself. He woke with a start, the feeling of damp earth and living wood clinging to him. The house was silent, but the presence was closer than ever. It was in him. He walked to the mirror and looked at his reflection. The horns seemed more a part of him than ever before. No longer an affliction, but an appendage, as natural as his own arms. The valley had not just chosen him. It had grafted itself onto him. He knew what he had to do. He went to the small shed behind his house and found the axe. It was heavy and solid in his hands. He walked into the woods, not to the quarry, but to the clearing from his dream. The morning mist clung to the ground. He chose a young, slender hemlock at the edge of the clearing. He did not know why this one. He just knew. He raised the axe and brought it down. The blade bit deep into the trunk with a solid, satisfying thunk. A jolt, like a small electric shock, went up his arms and through the horns on his head. And with it came a single, clear, unbidden thought. Not his own, but the town's. It was the memory of a child's laughter, pure and uncomplicated, from a time before secrets. It was a gift. He chopped until the tree fell. He would use the wood to build a new table for his kitchen. A piece of the grove inside his home. A piece of the truth made into something useful. The work was hard, and with every swing of the axe, a new fragment of the town's collective memory flashed through him. A first kiss, a lost toy, a moment of small, private courage. He was not just unburdening them of their sins. He was remembering their joys. The valley was not just hungry for sorrow. It was thirsty for every part of them, and he was its cup. Story 3. The first thing I noticed was the silence of the birds. We had been walking for days through the skeletal remains of the pine forest, and their chatter had been our constant companion. A brittle music against the wind that sighed through the needled branches. Then, in the space between one breath and the next, it was gone. Not a single chirp, not the rustle of a wing, not even the scuttling of things in the undergrowth. The absence was a physical weight, a cold spot in the air that pressed against the eardrums. Aiden stopped, his hand going to the worn grip of the revolver at his hip. He didn't need to speak. We all felt it. The world had drawn a breath and was holding it. We were a sorry band of pilgrims on a road none of us had chosen. Aiden, the gunslinger, was our compass, a man carved from gristle and quiet resolve, his eyes the color of a winter sky and just as distant. He led because he was the only one who seemed to know the way, or at least the only one who was not afraid to admit we were lost. Then there was Alara, who could mend a wound with a touch and a whisper, her fingers often stained with the ink of the strange symbols she drew in her tattered journal. And Kale, whose broad shoulders had carried more than his share of our supplies, and whose laughter, once a booming sound, had dwindled to a ghost of itself. And then there was the boy, Dion. He walked in our midst, a small, silent figure of 12 summers. His eyes too old for his face. He was the reason we were here. He was the key, Aiden said, though to what lock, in what terrible door, he would not say. The forest gave way to a landscape of wound earth and shattered rock. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and rust, a metallic tang that coated the tongue. In the distance, always in the distance, the dark tower stood. It was not a structure of stone and mortar as one might imagine, but a spiraling column of what looked like solidified night, a rip in the fabric of the sky itself. It pulsed with a slow, sick rhythm, a heartbeat that was felt more than heard, a deep, subsonic thrum that vibrated in the teeth and the bones. It pulled at you, a terrible gravity for the soul. We did not speak of it. To acknowledge it was to give it power, to admit the sheer, crawling insanity of our destination. We came upon the first of the monstrous creations at the edge of a dead river. Its waters were viscous and shone with a rainbow sheen, like oil on a puddle. Spanning the flow was a thing that might once have been a bridge, but was now a grotesque sculpture of flesh and iron. Ribbons of pale-veined skin were stretched taut over a framework of rusted I-beams, and at its center, a great lidless eye, milky and blind, stared out at nothing. It blinked slowly, a film of mucus sliding over the orb with a sound like wet leather. There was no way around. The banks were sheer, and the river itself exhaled a vapor that made the lungs ache. Aiden approached the bridge, his steps slow and deliberate. The eye tracked him, not with sight, but with a deeper, more ancient sense. The fleshy cables of the bridge tensed. A low moan emanated from it, a sound of such profound and lonely agony that Kale took a step back, his face pale. "We have to cross," Aiden said, his voice low. He did not look back at us. "How?" Ilara asked, her own voice a tremulous thread. "It is alive. It is in pain. Everything in this place is alive and in pain," Aiden replied. "That is the nature of the world now." He reached out a hand, not to touch, but to hover just above the quivering surface. The bridge shuddered. Dion stepped forward then, moving past Aiden. He walked right up to the weeping eye and placed his small hand upon its cold, slick surface. The moaning ceased. The bridge went still. The eye seemed to focus, for a single, terrifying moment, on the boy's face. Then, the tension went out of the fleshy cords, and the way was clear. Dion said nothing, only retrieved his hand and wiped it on his trousers, his expression unreadable. We crossed in a silence, broken only by the squelch of our boots on the living surface. The days bled into one another, a smear of gray skies and haunted landscapes. We passed through a field of standing stones that whispered secrets in a language just below hearing, the words itching at the back of the mind. We skirted a swamp where willows wept a black, syrupy sap, and the reflections in the water showed faces that were not our own. We were tired, a deep soul sickness that no amount of sleep could cure. Our bonds, once a source of strength, grew thin and frayed. Kale's silence became a sullen wall. Ilara's hands shook when she tried to draw her symbols. Only Aiden and the boy seemed unchanged, the one a pillar of grim purpose, the other a vessel of quiet mystery. It was in the ruins of a city that had no name that we encountered the monstrous machine. It was not a creature of flesh, nor a ghost of magic, but a thing of pure, malevolent logic. It moved on 100 articulated legs, its body a labyrinth of grinding gears and spinning blades, all polished to a cruel silver gleam. It had no head, no face, only a single spinning red lens that scanned the rubble, emitting a high-pitched whine that drilled into the brain. It was hunting. We pressed ourselves into the hollow shell of a building, the dust of ages settling on our shoulders. We watched it through a crack in the wall as it methodically disassembled a smaller, dog-like automaton, reducing it to a neat pile of screws and wires in a matter of seconds. "It knows we are here," Cale breathed, his voice thick with terror. "It can smell our fear." "It does not smell," Aiden whispered, his eyes fixed on the machine. "It calculates. It is a predator of probability. Stay still. Do not even think too loudly." But the boy was moving. Dion's eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a kind of dreadful recognition. He took a step toward the broken window. Aiden's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. "No, bite. It is for me," Dion said, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the machine's whine. "It is here for me." The red lens swiveled. It fixed on our hiding place. The whine escalated to a shriek of targeting confirmation. The machine uncoiled, its 100 legs scrabbling against the broken concrete as it charged. "Run," Aiden commanded, and we broke from our cover like startled birds. We scrambled through the skeletal city. The machine's relentless pursuit, a symphony of shrieking metal behind us. It was faster than anything that size had a right to be, cleaving through walls and pillars as if they were paper. Cale, in a moment of desperate bravery, turned and heaved a chunk of rebar-laced concrete at it. The machine did not even slow. A blade flashed, and the concrete was dust. It was Alara who saved us. As the machine closed in, she stopped running. She turned, her journal in her hands, and began to chant. The words were not in any language I knew. They were sounds of power, of creation and unmaking. The air around her shimmered. The symbols in her book glowed with a faint blue light. She thrust her hands forward, and a wall of shimmering force erupted between us and the machine. The thing slammed into it, and for a moment the air crackled with contained energy. But the machine was relentless. Its red lens focused on the barrier, and it began to spin faster, analyzing, calculating. A high-frequency vibration started in its core, and the magical wall began to fracture, webbing with lines of failing light. "Go!" Alara screamed, her voice strained to breaking. "Take the boy, and go." Aiden did not hesitate. He grabbed Dion and pulled him onward. I followed, my heart a trapped bird in my chest. I looked back only once, just in time to see the wall shatter into a million shards of dying light. The machine surged forward, and its spinning blades passed through Alara as if she were mist. There was no blood, only a terrible, silent dissolution. She came apart into motes of blue light that were swallowed by the gray dust of the city. The machine paused, its lens scanning the empty space where she had been. Then it resumed its pursuit, its purpose undeterred. We did not stop until the city was far behind us, until the shrieking whine had faded back into the oppressive silence. We collapsed in the lee of a great, broken archway, gasping for air that tasted of ashes and loss. Cale was weeping, gray, heaving sobs that shook his large frame. Aiden's face was a mask of stone, but his hands trembled as he checked the chambers of his revolver. Dion sat apart from us, his knees drawn to his chest, staring at the tower, which now loomed larger than ever, its dark pulse of physical pressure against our skin. "She is gone," Cale moaned. "She is gone because of him." He pointed a trembling finger at Dion. "She is gone because this world is broken," Aiden said, his voice hollow. "The boy is just a piece of it." "What is he?" I asked, the question I had carried for weeks finally breaking free. "What is he, Aiden? Why are we taking him to that thing. Aiden looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his resolve, a deep and terrible weariness. He is the echo, he said. He is the memory of the world that was, before the tower began to beat. He is the only thing that can silence the heart of the world. The final approach was across a plain of black glass. The sky above was a swirl of bruised purple and green, and the tower dominated everything. A column of absolute negation. There were no more monsters, no more trials. There was only the walk, and the pull, and the growing sense that we were not men walking on the earth, but blood cells being drawn through a vein toward a dying heart. The base of the tower was a maw of swirling shadows. There was no door, only an entrance, a vortex of dark matter that whispered promises and threats in the same breath. Kale refused to go further. He stood his ground, his axe held tight in his hands. "I will wait here," he said. "I will wait for you to come back." We all knew he was lying. There was no coming back. Aiden and I, with Dion between us, stepped into the shadow. Inside, there was no up or down, no left or right. There was only the tower and its heart. We walked on a path that was not a path, through geometries that hurt the mind to perceive. The walls, if they were walls, were lined with shifting, nightmarish tableaus, glimpses of other worlds, other times, all being slowly digested by the tower's relentless pulse. And through it all, that low, rhythmic thrum, now so loud it was a physical force, shaking the very marrow in our bones. At the center, in a chamber that was both infinitesimally small and infinitely vast, was the source. It was not a machine, nor a god, nor a demon. It was an organ, a vast beating heart of black crystal, suspended in the air by threads of crackling energy. With each beat, a wave of darkness flowed out from it, a wave that was the silence of birds, the dissolution of magic, the rust of time itself. And standing before it was a figure, a man-shaped void, the unseen force that had pulled us here. It turned, and though it had no face, I felt its attention focus on Dion. "You have brought it," a voice said. A voice that was not a sound, but the absence of sound given meaning. "I have come home," Dion said. His small voice was steady, but it was filled with a sorrow as deep as time. The heart beat. The darkness surged. The void figure stretched out a hand. "It is time to end the experiment. The anomaly must be reabsorbed. The system must be made whole." Aiden raised his revolver. It looked like a child's toy in that immense place. He fired. The bullet passed through the void figure and struck the crystal heart. There was a sound like a universe shattering, a high, clear chime that went on and on. A web of white light spread across the black crystal. The heartbeat faltered. The void figure shrieked, a silent scream that was a vacuum in the soul. It lunged for Dion, but the boy was already moving. He did not run away. He ran toward the heart. He placed his hands upon the fractured crystal, and he began to glow with a soft, warm, golden light. It was the light of a forgotten sun, of a bird's song in a pine forest, of Alara's healing touch, of Kale's lost laughter. It was the light of everything the tower had consumed. "I am not the echo," Dion said, his voice now vast and gentle. "I am the original note." The light from his body flowed into the heart. The black crystal turned transparent, then white, then it could not be looked upon. The heartbeats stopped. The rhythmic thrum that had been the background noise of our existence for so long ceased. The silence that followed was not the silence of absence, but the silence of peace. It was the first true silence I had ever known. The void figure dissolved into motes of nothing. The tower around us began to unravel, the solidified night turning to mist, then to memory. I found myself standing on the black glass plain. The tower was gone. The sky above was a clean, pale blue. Aiden stood beside me, his revolver hanging useless at his side. He looked old, and tired, and free. We made our way back to the edge of the pine forest. Cale was gone, vanished with the world that had held him. We were alone. We did not speak of what had happened. There were no words for it. We simply walked, and as we entered the shade of the trees, I heard it, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was the sound of a single bird beginning to sing. The sound was so fragile, so impossibly pure, that it seemed to stop time itself. Aiden froze mid-step, his head tilting upward. The lines of grim endurance etched into his face softened, not into a smile, but into a kind of awe I'd never seen there. He was a man hearing music from a childhood he thought long erased. We stood there for a long time, just listening, as the single clear note was joined by another, and then another, until a hesitant chorus filled the air. The forest was no longer skeletal. The pines were still thin, their branches sparse, but the grayish cast to their needles was giving way to a healthier, darker green. The wind that moved through them no longer sighed with exhaustion. It whispered. It carried the scent of damp earth and living resin, washing the taste of rust and ozone from my mouth. We walked on, and with every step, the world seemed to breathe more deeply. Patches of tough, green grass pushed through the cracked soil. We found a stream, not the oily, rainbow-slicked river of the Deadlands, but clear water running over smooth stones. We drank from our hands, and the water was cold and clean, without the metallic aftertaste we had grown accustomed to. Aiden finally broke our long silence. His voice was rough, but quiet, as if he feared to disturb the new peace. "He will be everywhere now," he said, "in the sap of these trees, in the song of that bird. He's the world again." I knew he meant Dion. I nodded, the truth of it settling in my chest. A warm, heavy stone. Elara's magic, Cale's strength, all of it was not lost, but returned, scattered into the soil and the air. We were the only ones who remembered the weight of what had been. We were the sole guardians of a terrible and beautiful secret. We came to a clearing where the sun broke through the canopy in dappled shafts of gold. Aiden sat on a fallen log, the weariness of 1,000 miles finally overtaking him. He laid his revolver on the moss beside him, and it looked like what it was. A piece of dead metal. An artifact from a nightmare that was finally over. "What will you do?" I asked him. He looked around the clearing, at the light on the forest floor. "I will walk," he said. "I will walk until I find a place where the memory of the tower does not follow me. And then I will stop." He did not ask me what I would do. There was an unspoken understanding that our paths, forged in the crucible of that shared journey, had now diverged. We had carried the key together, and now that the lock was turned, our purpose was spent. We were just two men in a healing wood. I left him there, sitting in the sun. I walked east, toward the rising sun with no destination in mind. The forest grew thicker and richer with every mile. I saw rabbits darting through the undergrowth. I saw a deer, its coat sleek and brown, watching me from a distance before bounding away. Life was returning, stubborn and brave. Days later, I came upon the outskirts of a small settlement. It was a humble place, a cluster of wooden cabins with smoke curling from their chimneys. The people there were wary, their faces hardened by a lifetime of survival in a broken world. But their eyes did not hold the hollow fear I was used to. They took me in, fed me a stew of roots and wild game, and asked me where I had come from. I told them I had been walking from the west. They nodded, and one of the elders said, "The air is better from the west these days. The sickness is lifting." I did not tell them why. I simply agreed. I stayed in that village. I helped them build a new fence, and I taught them how to track the deer that were now returning. I found a peace I had never thought possible. In the simple rhythm of days, in the weight of an axe in my hands, in the sound of children playing without fear. Sometimes, at dusk, when the birdsong settled into a contented twilight murmur, I would look to the western horizon and think of Aiden walking, and of the boy who had become the world. And I would feel gratitude so vast, it had no name. A quiet, echoing note in the growing symphony of a reborn earth. The seasons turned, and the settlement grew. New families arrived, drawn by rumors of clean water and land that yielded more than stones and bitter roots. I became a part of the place, my past a shadow that grew fainter with each passing year. They called me the Man from the West, a title that held a quiet respect, and no one pressed for the story behind it. One morning, a child, a little girl with grass-stained knees and eyes the color of the summer sky, brought me a flower. It was a simple thing, a white-petaled bloom with a yellow center, but it was the first of its kind I had seen since the world broke. "It smells like the sun," she said, pressing it into my hand before running off to play. I held the flower, its fragile stem cool against my calloused fingers. It was then I felt it, a resonance so faint it was almost a dream. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a warmth that pulsed once gently from the earth beneath my feet and traveled up through my bones. It was the same golden warmth I had felt in the heart of the tower. Dion was not just in the trees or the birds. He was in the soil, in the new growth, in the heart of this child who had never known a silent sky. The world was not just healing, it was remembering how to be alive. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the fireflies blink their first hesitant lights of the year, I knew Aiden had found his place to stop. The certainty settled over me like a warm blanket. He was at rest somewhere, under this same wide, quiet sky. The memory of the tower no longer followed either of us, because the tower was now just a memory, fading like a scar. The long, grim night was over, and in the gentle darkness, the world, once more, was breathing on its own. The years softened the sharp edges of memory, turning the horrors of our journey into tales I would sometimes tell the children on long winter nights. I spoke of a brave woman who drew light from the air, and a strong man whose laughter could shake the trees. I never spoke of the tower or the boy. Those truths were mine alone to carry, a sacred weight that grew lighter as the world grew heavier with life. I took a wife. Her name was Lyra, and she had a voice that could calm a storm. We built a cabin on the edge of the settlement, near the pine forest, that was now thick and deep, and hummed with 1,000 different lives. Our children played in the streams I had once found miraculous. To them, it was all ordinary. The songs of the birds were simply the sound of morning. The profusion of flowers was just the way of the world. My greatest triumph was that they lived in a world that required no bravery from them, only wonder. One autumn, when the air was crisp and the leaves were a blaze of fire, a traveler came to the village. He was an old man, his back bent under a pack, his face a road map of hard miles. He settled by the communal fire, and the villagers, ever generous, offered him food and drink. I brought him a bowl of stew and sat beside him. We talked of the weather and the hunting to the north. His voice was a dry rustle, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He told a story then not to me, but to the gathering crowd. He spoke of a wanderer he had met many years ago in the southern deserts. A grim, quiet man who carried an empty revolver. This man, the traveler said, had helped his people find a hidden spring, a source of water that had brought a dead valley back to life. He had stayed with them for a season, building walls and teaching them how to defend their flocks from the desert cats. He never spoke of where he came from, but one evening the traveler recalled, The man had pointed to a particularly bright star in the western sky and had said, "A friend of mine is under that star. I hope his silence is as peaceful as mine." The traveler never learned the man's name. He moved on before the first snows. I sat very still, the heat from the fire warming my face. I looked up at the clear, cold sky, at the bright, steady star the old man had vaguely gestured toward. A deep and final peace settled within me. The story was complete. Every thread had been woven back into the tapestry. I looked at my wife, who was laughing at something one of our sons had said, her face glowing in the firelight. I listened to the chorus of crickets and the crackle of the flames. It was not a perfect world. It was simply the world, whole and true. And it was enough. The following spring, the river swelled with snowmelt and changed its course, carving a new channel that exposed a foundation of blackened fused stone near the western edge of our land. It was a remnant of the old world, a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. The sight of it sent a cold jolt through me, a phantom pain from a life I had nearly forgotten. The children saw it as a new playground, a place to climb and chase. I watched them for a long time, their small, vibrant lives swarming over the dead thing, and I felt no fear, only a distant, quiet sorrow. I gathered the men and we broke the stone apart, levering the pieces from the earth with pry bars and muscle. We did not speak of what it was. We simply worked, reducing the monolith to manageable rubble. We used the stones to build a new bridge across the river, a solid, humble structure that would serve the community for generations. It was the only memorial any of us would ever need. The past was not to be feared or worshipped, but broken down and used to build a better present. That night, Lyra found me staring out the window, my hands still raw from the labor. She did not ask what was on my mind. She simply stood beside me, her shoulder touching mine. Her presence, a quiet anchor in the flow of time. The moon was rising, full and bright, washing the land in a silver glow. It illuminated the new bridge, turning its rough-hewn stones into a path of light across the dark water. It was not an end, but a connection, a way forward. And as I stood there with my wife, I understood that our story had not ended in the tower's heart or on the black glass plain. It was here, in this quiet room, in this gentle night, forever beginning again. The first time my daughter asked about the scar on my palm, the one shaped like a tiny, jagged star, I told her it was from a thorn. She was young, and the answer satisfied her. But as she grew, her eyes, the same clear sky blue as her mother's, saw more. She saw the way I sometimes paused, a wooden bowl half carved in my hands, listening to a sound that was no longer there. She saw the way I cherished silence, not as an absence, but as a gift. One evening, when she was nearly grown, we were walking back from the berry patches, our baskets full. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. She stopped and pointed to the west, where the first star of the evening glittered with a fierce, clean light. "You always look at that star," she said. Her voice was not accusing, merely observant. "Is that where you came from?" I looked from the star to her face, so full of a life that had known only peace. The old words, the ones I had carried for so long, felt like stones in my throat. But she was my daughter, and the world she lived in was the one we had fought for. It was hers by right. "No," I said, my voice softer than the twilight. "That is just a point to steer by, where I came from. It's gone now." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looped her arm through mine, her touch as light as a bird's wing. "I'm glad you're here," she said simply. We walked on, and the past, that great and terrible weight, finally felt not like a burden, but like a story that had been told to its proper end. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. From the village ahead, We could hear the sounds of laughter and the soft strum of a lute. It was not a perfect world, but it was a complete one. And we were home. The lute music grew clearer as we approached. A simple, meandering melody that spoke of contentment rather than joy, which was a finer thing. My daughter hummed along, her steps falling in time with the tune. At the edge of the village green, she squeezed my arm and darted off toward the sound, her basket of berries held aloft like a trophy. I watched her go, her form merging with the other young people gathered around the musician. I set my own basket by the communal storehouse and walked toward my cabin. The light from the windows was a warm, golden square against the deepening blue of night. Lyra would be inside, mending clothes or stirring the stew, and the thought was a solid, comforting thing. But I found I wasn't quite ready to go in. The evening held a particular clarity, a stillness that felt like a held breath. I walked past our home and followed a narrow path that led to the new bridge. The moon had risen higher, its light so bright it cast sharp shadows. The black stones of the bridge seemed to drink the light, holding a memory of darkness within their smooth, water-worn surfaces. I walked to its center and leaned against the railing, looking down at the water chattering below. And then I felt it again, that faint, golden resonance. It was stronger here, perhaps because of the stones, or perhaps because this was a place where past and present had been physically joined. It pulsed once, a gentle thrum that traveled up from the stone through the soles of my feet and settled in my chest. It was a feeling of rightness, of a circle closed so perfectly its seam was invisible. I knew then that I would never feel it again. The last echo had faded. The work was truly done. There was no more need for a guardian, for a rememberer. The story could finally be forgotten because it had become the world itself. A cool breeze swept down from the pines, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers. It rustled the leaves of the willow trees that now grew along the bank, their long branches trailing in the current. From the village, the lute music shifted into a slower, sweeter song, and the voices of the children joined in, soft and hesitant at first, then gaining strength. I pushed myself away from the railing and turned my back on the bridge. I walked toward the warm light of my home, toward the sound of the singing. The night air was soft on my skin, and the path beneath my feet was solid and sure. The singing grew as I walked, no longer just the voices of the children, but of the whole village, a low and harmonious hum that seemed to vibrate in the wood grain of the cabins and the very soil underfoot. It was not a song of celebration, but of existence, a sound as natural and unforced as the flow of the stream. Lyra was waiting for me at the door, her silhouette framed by the firelight from within. She didn't ask where I had been. She simply reached out and took my hand, her fingers lacing through mine. And her touch was the final anchor. We stood there together on the threshold, listening. The melody wove itself around the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. It was a fabric of sound, thick and warm, and we were both held within it. I looked at our joined hands, at the simple, strong lines of her fingers against my own scarred ones, and I knew that this was the true shape of the peace we had bought with our pain. It was not in grand monuments or whispered legends. It was in this quiet moment, in this shared breath, in the unspoken understanding that passed between us like a current. Later, as we lay in the dark, I listened to the rhythm of her breathing beside me. The lute had fallen silent, and the village was asleep. The only sound was the wind in the pines, a gentle, sighing breath that had once been a dying rattle and was now a lullaby. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in decades, I did not dream of glass plains or silent skies. I dreamed of roots pushing deep into dark, rich soil, and of a single clear note of music that hung in the air forever, sustaining everything. The morning came, soft and gray with a promise of rain. I woke with a feeling of lightness, as if a season of inner weather had finally broken. Lyra was already up, the space beside me cool. I could hear the quiet clatter of her preparing breakfast, the familiar sounds of our life together. I rose and dressed, the coarse linen of my shirt feeling like a blessing against my skin. I joined her at the small table by the window. She pushed a bowl of porridge toward me, her eyes meeting mine with a quiet knowing. We ate in a silence that was not empty but full. The rain began then, a gentle pattering on the roof and the leaves outside, washing the world in shades of green and gray. When the meal was done, I stood and took my walking staff from its place by the door. Lyra nodded. It was a day for walking. I stepped out into the damp, clean air, the rain a fine mist on my face. I did not take the path to the bridge, or to the berry patches, or to any of the places that held the weight of memory. I walked instead into the deepest part of the woods, where the pine canopy was so thick, the rain barely touched the soft floor of needles. I walked without purpose, my steps slow and measured. I listened to the drip of water from the branches and the scurry of unseen creatures. I saw a flash of a fox's red coat between the trees. A quick, vibrant life with no thought of towers or lost work. I walked until the sounds of the village were completely gone, swallowed by the forest. I walked until I found a great ancient oak, its trunk wider than I could span with my arms. I sat down with my back against its rough bark, the solidity of it a comfort, and I let it all go. The image of Aiden's weary face, the blinding light from Ilara's hands, the terrible, beautiful silence after Dian's sacrifice. I let them rise up in my mind like leaves caught in a current, and I watched them drift away. The forest took them. The gentle rain washed them clean. The old oak held them in its rings of memory. I was just a man sitting in the woods in the rain. The story was over, and I was free to simply be. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of wet earth and living wood. And it was enough. It was everything. The rain eased to a drizzle and then stopped altogether. A shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, piercing the canopy and setting the wet leaves aglow. Steam began to rise from the forest floor, a soft, shimmering exhalation. I stood, my muscles stiff from sitting, and placed my hand against the oak's trunk one last time. It felt neither cold nor warm, but simply alive. My walk back was different. The woods were the same, the path was the same, but the filter through which I saw them had been wiped clean. I noticed the intricate pattern of a spider's web, beaded with rainbows strung between two ferns. I heard the distinct, three-note call of a bird I had never bothered to identify. The weight of the past had been a lens that distorted everything, focusing only on shadows and echoes. Now, the world was simply itself, immediate and vivid. When I reached the edge of the village, the air was fresh and washed clean. The children were already out, their boots splashing in the puddles, their laughter sharp and clear in the damp air. My daughter saw me and waved, her smile a quick, bright flash. She was helping Lyra hang laundry on the line, the wet sheets snapping in the brisk wind. I went to them and took a corner of a sheet, my fingers brushing against Lyra's as we pinned it up. The simple, domestic act felt like a prayer. That night, there was no lute music, no gathering around the fire. The rain had returned, a steady, soothing drum on the roof. We sat inside, Lyra and I and our children, the fire in the hearth painting dancing shadows on the walls. My son was whittling a piece of wood, his brow furrowed in concentration. My daughter was reading from a book of old tales, her voice a soft murmur. I looked at them, these people I loved, in this home we had built, and I felt a quiet, unshakable certainty. The long work of remembrance was done. The future was no longer something to be built from the ruins of the past, but something to be lived, one ordinary, precious day at a time. The story had not ended. It had simply become life itself. Story 4. The first thing you must understand is the silence. Not an ordinary quiet, not the gentle hush of a sleeping house or the peaceful stillness of a winter morning. This was a different kind of silence altogether. It was a thick, woolen silence. A silence that had been packed into the corners of the room and stuffed under the doors. A silence that swallowed sound whole. And at the center of this silence sat the clock on the mantelpiece, a cheap, battery-operated thing with a pale plastic face. Its second hand was frozen, caught between one heartbeat and the next. A tiny red spear aimed forever at the number 4. It had been like that for 3 days. Fred had not bothered to change the battery. He found he preferred it this way, this suspension of the inevitable tick-tock progression. It made the air in the small clapboard house feel heavy and permanent, like water at the bottom of a very deep well. He lived on the frayed edge of a dying town, a place where the trees seemed to lean away from the wind as if trying to escape. The house had been his mother's, and her mother's before that, and it carried the scent of their lives in its bones, a faint, sweet and sour odor of dried roses and mothballs, and the slow metallic decay of old age. Fred was a man who drew no attention to himself. He worked the night shift at the bottling plant on the county line, a job that required no conversation, only the monotonous clatter of glass on a conveyor belt under the sickly orange glow of industrial lights. His co-workers, the few who noticed him at all, thought him quiet, perhaps a little slow. They did not see the meticulous order of his mind, the neat and careful filing system where he kept his observations. He watched the women, not with the clumsy hunger of a lonely man, but with the focused, analytical eye of a collector. He saw the way the checkout girl at the grocery store tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the specific curve of her wrist. He noted the lilt in the voice of the woman who read the news on the local radio station, a voice like smooth, dark honey. He admired the way a certain waitress at the diner walked, a rolling, graceful gait that spoke of a hidden strength. These were fragments, you see, shards of a beautiful broken vase. And Fred, in the profound and patient silence of his stopped clock house, had begun to believe he was the only one who could put them back together. He was not building a woman. He was assembling a companion. A perfect, silent companion who would never leave, who would never have thoughts of her own, who would simply be a companion to share the silence. His mother's old sewing room, at the back of the house where the light from the street lamp did not reach, became his workshop. He had cleared it out, scrubbed the floors with ammonia until they were pale and bloodless, and sealed the window with a sheet of plywood and black insulation foam. The air in there was cold and still, smelling sharply of antiseptic and the coppery tang of the tools he had laid out on a clean white sheet. Pliers, a hacksaw, several very sharp knives, all polished to a surgical gleam. He worked with a calm, methodical precision. There was no frenzy in him, no rage. This was a craft, an art. The first one was the girl from the roadside produce stand. She had hair the color of wheat and a laugh that reminded him of the wind chimes his mother had once hung on the porch. He took her on a Tuesday, when the sky was the color of bruised flesh and the air tasted of coming rain. It was surprisingly easy. A stalled car, a request for help, a rag soaked in chloroform pressed over a mouth that had just moments before been offering him a sample of fresh-picked strawberry. He carried her into the house, through the perpetual twilight of the silent living room, and into the cold, clean space at the back. He worked for a long time. He was careful. He was respectful. But she was not right. Something was missing. The hair was perfect, yes, but when he arranged it, it felt like straw, not like hair. The eyes, which had been so vibrant, became dull and cloudy in the jar where he kept them. She was a collection of parts, not a whole. A failed prototype. He buried the remains in the black, loamy soil of the backyard, under the sprawling ancient oak tree that never seemed to lose its leaves, even in the dead of winter. He tried again. The waitress with the graceful walk. He took her ankles, the tendons and bones so elegantly constructed. But when he attached them, they were just ankles. They did not carry the grace he had admired. They were inert. A piece of meat. He felt a flicker of frustration then. A cold spark in the vast, quiet tundra of his mind. He was missing the essential ingredient, the thing that would animate the clay, that would turn his collection of beautiful things into a single beautiful being. His sister, Martha, called sometimes. Her voice on the answering machine was a thin, worried scratch in the silence. "Fred, just checking in. You're so quiet these days. Are you eating?" The house must be so empty now that Mom's gone. He never picked up. He would stand in the living room, watching the frozen clock, and listen to her voice evaporate into the stuffed air. She did not understand. The house was not empty. It was filling up. It was becoming a gallery of potential. The revelation came to him one night as he was watching an old black and white movie on television. The sound was off, and the actress on the screen moved with a pantomime of emotion that was far more powerful, far more pure than any real feeling could be. It was the silence, her perfect, beautiful silence. That was it. The women he had taken, they had been too loud. Their lives, their memories, their voices, they were impurities. They were flaws in the crystal. He needed to find a woman who was already silent. A woman whose essence was not in her laugh or her words, but in her stillness. He found her at the library. She worked in the local history section, a pale, quiet woman with large, dark eyes and hands that moved over the brittle pages of old books with a reverent tenderness. Her name was Clara. She never spoke above a whisper. She seemed to exist in a world of her own, a world of faded ink and ghostly photographs. She was perfect. He began to visit the library every day, sitting at a table near her desk, watching her. He learned her schedule. She lived alone in a small apartment above a shuttered bookstore. She had no family that ever visited. She was a sketch, an outline waiting for his hand to fill her in, to give her purpose. He took her on a night when the moon was a thin, sharp sliver in the sky, a surgeon's scalpel. He used the chloroform again, catching her as she unlocked her apartment door. She was lighter than the others, a bundle of bird-like bones and soft, plain fabric. He carried her back to his house, through the profound and waiting silence, and laid her on the clean white table in the room at the back of the house. This time, he did not rush. He looked at her, at the peaceful, unconscious expression on her face. He touched her cheek. Her skin was cool. He began his work, not with the dispassionate efficiency of before, but with a new, trembling sense of ceremony. This was the one. He was sure of it. He would not disassemble her. He would enhance her. He would make her eternal. He would give her the best of everything he had collected. He worked through the night. He stitched the wheat-colored hair into her own mousy brown locks, strand by strand. He carefully, lovingly removed her eyes and replaced them with the clear blue ones from the girl at the produce stand, setting them into the sockets with the precision of a jeweler. He did not like her hands. They were too thin, too nervous. He took the strong, capable hands of the waitress, severing them at the wrist and grafting them onto Clara's arms, suturing the skin with a fine, invisible thread. He worked until his back ached and his own eyes felt gritty and dry. He worked until the thing on the table began to resemble the image in his mind, a beautiful, composite angel, a being of perfect, assembled parts. When he was finished, he stepped back. He wiped his hands on a clean white towel. He looked at his creation, lying there in the stark light of the single bare bulb overhead. She was beautiful. Terribly, unnervingly beautiful. The different shades of hair created a strange patchwork halo around her head. The blue eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling. The new hands lay palms up at her sides, looking strong and foreign. He had done it. He had made his companion. He waited. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of the stopped clock, of the deep well, of the grave. He waited for a sign, for some flicker of awareness, for the moment her new blue eyes would focus on him, and she would understand what he had done for her, what he had made her. Nothing. The cold knot began to tighten in his stomach. He leaned closer. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice a rusty, unfamiliar sound in the dead air. Nothing. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her cheek. The skin was cold and waxy. He shook her shoulder, gently at first, then more roughly. The head lolled to the side. The blue eyes did not blink. The chest did not rise. She was just a thing, a doll, a collection of the finest parts, assembled with the utmost care, and it was all for nothing. There was no spark, no life. The magic he had believed in, the alchemy of possession, was a lie. A sound escaped his lips, a small broken thing, like the cry of a wounded animal. The frustration that had been a spark now erupted into a cold black fire. He stumbled back, knocking over a tray of tools. They clattered to the floor, a shocking, violent noise in the silence. He looked around the room, at his clean white walls, now spattered with the evidence of his failure. He looked at the thing on the table, his perfect companion. A corpse in a puppet show. He fled the room, slamming the door shut behind him. He stood in his dark living room, breathing in great, ragged gulps of the stale air. The clock on the mantel still pointed its red spear at the number 4. Time had not moved. Nothing had changed. The silence was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer a comfortable blanket. It was a judgment. It was the silence of a universe that was vast and empty, and did not care about his loneliness, his art, his perfect, silent companion. He walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the world was beginning to lighten. Dawn was stuck at the edge of the sky, a thin gray line of light that refused to brighten. A dawn that would not come. He saw a car slow down as it passed his house. It was his sister Martha's car. It pulled over to the curb and stopped. The driver's side door opened and Martha got out. She stood there for a moment, looking at the house, her face a pale, worried oval in the gloom. She took a step toward the porch. Then, another. Fred did not move. He stood behind the curtain, watching her. He could hear the floorboards in the room at the back of the house creaking, a slow, settling sound. Or perhaps the sound of something shifting its weight, testing its new, borrowed limbs. He knew it was just the old house settling. Of course it was. He had failed. There was nothing in that room but his shame and his ruin. Martha was on the porch now. He could see her hand raised, about to knock on the door. He looked from the door to the hallway that led to the back room. The house was perfectly still. The clock was silent. The dawn was frozen. And Fred stood in the center of it all, a man caught between a world that was about to break in and a silence he had created that was now, finally, beginning to whisper back. He let the curtain fall back into place, its faded fabric a flimsy shield against the impending intrusion. The knock, when it came, was not loud, but it was insistent. It was the sound of reality, of concerned sisters and casserole dishes, and all the messy, noisy things he had tried so hard to wall out. Each rap of her knuckles against the wood was a tiny crack in the perfect, sealed world of his house. He did not answer. He stood rooted in the center of the room, his hands hanging limp at his sides. He could feel the silence straining, stretching thin like a membrane about to tear. Martha called his name, her voice muffled but clear, laced with a familiar, weary anxiety. "Fred, I know you're in there." Your car's out front. I'm not leaving this time." He heard the jingle of keys. She still had the spare key her mother had given her. The lock on the front door turned with a click that was as loud as a gunshot in the stagnant air. The door swung inward, and the world rushed in with her. A gust of cool, damp morning air, the scent of wet pavement, the faint, distant sound of a bird singing. The ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning felt like a violent assault. Martha stepped inside, her practical shoes making soft, scuffing sounds on the hardwood floor. She was a smaller, sharper version of their mother, her face pinched with worry. "Fred," she said, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "What in God's name is that smell?" He said nothing. He just watched her, his expression as blank as the plastic face of the clock on the mantel. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the dust motes dancing in the sliver of light from the door, the general air of neglect, and finally settling on him. "Are you sick?" she asked, her voice softening. "You look terrible." She took a step toward him, and then her eyes caught something else. They drifted past him, down the short hallway that led to the bedrooms, and, at the very end, to the sealed door of the sewing room. A line of something dark and faintly glistening marked the floorboards leading from that door to where he stood. It was a smudge, barely noticeable unless you were looking for disorder, but Martha had always been looking for disorder in his life. "What is that?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. She pointed a trembling finger toward the hallway. "Fred, what have you done in there? Is it a leak? A dead animal?" He found his voice then, but it was a dry, rusted thing. "Don't," he said. But she was already moving, driven by a sister's duty and a rising tide of dread. She walked past him, her body cutting through the thick air. He could have reached out and stopped her. He had the strength. But he was paralyzed, a spectator to the unraveling of his own life. She stopped at the door to the sewing room. She placed her hand on the knob. "It's cold," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Then she turned it. The door did not open. He had locked it from the inside, a habit born of secrecy. Martha jiggled the handle, frustration mounting. "Fred, the key. Give me the key." From inside the room, there was a sound. A soft, dry, shuffling sound, like bare feet on a rough wooden floor. Martha froze, her head cocked. "What was that?" "It's the house," Fred said, the lie automatic and hollow. "It settles." Her eyes met his, and he saw the moment her concern curdled into real fear. She knew that sound was not the house settling. It was too deliberate, too organic. She took a step back from the door, her hand going to her mouth. "Oh, Fred, what have you got in there?" The shuffling sound came again, closer to the door this time. Then, a faint, slow scrape, as if a fingernail were being dragged down the inside of the wood. Martha's breath hitched. Her face lost all its color. She backed away, her steps clumsy, until she bumped into the wall opposite the door. She stared at her brother, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrific understanding. The smell, the locked door, the sounds, his utter stillness. It all coalesced into a truth she could not yet speak. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, jerkily. It turned one way, then the other, as if being fumbled by a hand that did not quite know how it worked. The lock, a simple bolt, held fast. Martha let out a small, choked whimper. She fumbled in her purse, her hands shaking too badly to find her phone. Fred watched the doorknob. He felt a strange, detached curiosity. He had failed. He knew he had failed. There was no life in that room. And yet, the doorknob was turning. The thing inside was moving. It was impossible. It was just a collection of parts. A doll. The scraping on the door intensified. It was joined by a low, thudding noise, a dull impact against the wood. Once, twice. Martha found her phone. She dropped it. The plastic clattered on the floor. She didn't pick it up. She was staring, transfixed, at the thin line at the bottom of the door. A darkness was spreading there, seeping out from under the doorframe. It wasn't water. It was thick and dark, and it carried with it the coppery, sweet smell of the room, now mixed with something else, something old and corrupt. The thudding stopped. The scraping stopped. The doorknob was still. For a long moment, there was only the sound of Martha's ragged breathing and the faint, distant bird outside. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice spoke. It was a dry, rasping sound, the sound of dust and disuse. It was a patchwork of voices, a hint of the checkout girl lilt, a ghost of the radio announcer's honey, a memory of Clara's whisper, all stitched together into a single, impossible word. Fred, the sound of his name, spoken in that impossible, cobbled-together voice, did not fill him with terror or even wonder. It simply completed the circuit. The silence was broken, but not by the world outside. It was broken from within his own creation. The knot in his stomach loosened, replaced by a cold, clear understanding. He had not failed. He had simply misunderstood the nature of the spark. Martha screamed. It was a short, sharp sound, cut off as her hand clamped over her own mouth. She scrambled backward, away from the door, her eyes wild with a primal fear. The thing on the other side of the door was silent again. Fred took a step forward. Then, another. He walked past his cowering sister, his movements calm and deliberate. He stopped in front of the door. He could see the dark sea-page pooling on the floorboards, touching the toes of his shoes. The key was in his pocket. He pulled it out, a simple silver key that felt ice-cold in his hand. Martha was whispering now, a frantic, pleading prayer. "Don't, Fred. Don't open it. Please, for the love of God, don't open that door." He inserted the key into the lock. The click was soft, definitive. He turned the knob and pushed. The door swung inward on silent hinges. The room beyond was exactly as he had left it, illuminated by the single, bare bulb. The tools were still on the floor where he had knocked them over. The white sheet on the table was rumpled and stained, but the table was empty. His gaze swept the room and found her standing in the far corner, facing the wall. She was a stark silhouette against the pale wood, her form a jarring composition of mismatched parts. The wheat-colored hair was tangled. The waitress's strong hands hung at her sides, fingers slightly curled. She was perfectly still. Martha, from the hallway, let out another choked sound. The thing in the corner slowly began to turn. It was not a smooth motion. It was a series of jerks, a marionette learning its strings. First one foot shuffled on the floor, then the other. The torso twisted, the head lagging behind. Finally, the face came into view. The blue eyes were no longer cloudy. They were clear, but they were wrong. They did not focus together. One seemed to look at him, while the other stared at a point somewhere over his shoulder. The mouth, Clara's own delicate mouth, opened. The lips moved, dry and cracked. "Home," the voice rasped. It was a statement, devoid of question or emotion. Fred felt a smile touch his lips. It was a small, tired thing. "Yes," he said, "you are home." The thing took a step forward. Its gait was uneven, a lurching stumble. One of the ankles, the graceful one he had admired so much, turned inward with a sickening, wet pop. The creature did not react. It did not fall. It simply adjusted its weight and took another step, dragging the damaged foot behind it like a sack of stones. It was coming toward him. Its patchwork gaze was fixed on him now, both eyes somehow managing to hold him in their sightless focus. The smell of antiseptic and old blood was overwhelming. Martha was on her feet, pulling at his arm. "Fred, we have to go. We have to get out of here now." He shook her off. He could not leave. This was his masterpiece. It was flawed, yes. It was broken. But it was his. It had spoken his name. The creature was close now. It raised one of the waitress's hands. The fingers twitched, then slowly, deliberately, reached for his face. He stood his ground, watching, waiting for the touch. He expected coldness, the waxen feel of death. Instead, the fingers, when they brushed his cheek, were warm. A shudder ran through him, a convulsion of pure, unadulterated revelation. The warmth was not the warmth of life, but the low, persistent heat of decay, of cellular processes continuing in the absence of a soul. It was the warmth of the earth under the oak tree where he had buried the others. The fingers traced a line down his cheek. The mismatched eyes stared into his. "Alone," the creature whispered. And Fred knew then that it was right. He was alone. He had always been alone. This thing, this assembled silence, understood him perfectly. It was not a companion to end his loneliness. It was the embodiment of loneliness itself, given form and voice. It was his mirror. Behind him, Martha finally broke. He heard her footsteps retreating, frantic and stumbling, down the hall, through the living room, and out the front door, which she left hanging open. The gray morning light flooded in, illuminating the dust and the darkness of the house. The creature dropped its hand. It turned its head, its movements still jarring and wrong, and looked toward the open front door, toward the world. It took a lurching step in that direction, then another, its bad foot scraping a trail through the dark fluid on the floor. Fred did not try to stop it. He simply watched as his creation, his silence made flesh, shuffled out of the room, down the hall, and toward the waiting light. He stood and listened to the sound of its uneven steps on the porch, and then on the gravel path, fading away into the sound of the bird that was still singing, the bird that had not stopped singing through it all. He stood in the hallway for a long time after the sound of its passage had faded. The house was different now. The silence was no longer his. It had been taken from him, violated by his sister's screams and the thing's shuffling footsteps. The open front door was an accusation. He walked slowly to the threshold. The gray light was stronger now, washing the color from everything. He looked out at his quiet street. There was no sign of Martha. Her car was gone, the curb empty. There was no sign of the creature either, just the normal sleeping street. He stepped onto the porch. The air was cool and damp. He saw it then, a single dark footprint on the top step, a smudge of earth and something else. He followed the trail with his eyes. It led across the dew-damp lawn, toward the old oak tree at the edge of his property. The trail disappeared into the shadows beneath its branches. He knew where it was going. It was going home, back to the earth from which its parts had been taken. It was completing a circle he had never intended to close. He did not follow. There was no need. He went back inside and closed the front door. He did not lock it. The lock felt meaningless now. He walked through the empty living room and stood at the entrance to the hallway, looking at the open door of the sewing room. The light was still on. He could see the mess inside, the tools, the stained sheet. From the kitchen, the clock on the wall suddenly chimed. It was a cheap, battery-powered thing, a gift from Martha years ago. It had been stuck for so long, he had forgotten the sound of its bell. It chimed 5 times. 5 o'clock. The dawn had finally arrived. The sound was ordinary. It was the sound of time moving forward again. He listened to it fade, and in its wake, he heard the true silence of the house. It was not the deep, comfortable silence he had cultivated. It was a thin, hollow silence, the silence of an empty shell. He had filled it with his terrible art, and now his art had walked away, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own failure. He went into the sewing room. He righted the tray of tools. He picked up the soiled sheet, folding it with a strange automatic care. He worked methodically, cleaning the room, erasing the evidence. He was not hiding a crime. He was tidying up after a guest who had departed. When the room was clean, almost sterile, he turned off the light and closed the door. He did not lock it. He walked to his chair in the living room and sat down. He looked at his hands, resting on his knees. They were clean. They were capable. They had created a miracle and a monster, and now they were just hands again. Outside, a car door slammed. A neighbor starting their day. The world was waking up. He sat in his chair and watched the light through the curtains grow stronger. He did not move. He was waiting, not for a sound or a sign or a companion. He was simply waiting, because that was all that was left to do. The silence was his again, but he no longer knew what to do with it. The sun rose higher, bleaching the room of its shadows. The normal sounds of the neighborhood began to filter in through the walls. A lawnmower starting, a child shouting, the distant hum of a garbage truck. Each sound was a tiny needle prick in the bubble of his isolation. He had thought the outside world was a nuisance, but now he understood it was a shield. Without it, the silence had become a vacuum, and he had tried to fill it with something that could not live. A soft knock came at the door. It was not Martha's insistent rap. This was hesitant, almost polite. Fred did not get up. He heard the door push open, the squeak of its hinges now a familiar, weary sound. Officer Miller stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the light. He took off his hat, his kind, tired eyes scanning the room before settling on Fred in the chair. "Fred," he said, his voice calm, "Martha called us. She's pretty shaken up. Said there was something here. An animal, maybe." Fred looked at the policeman. He could tell him. He could say it wasn't an animal. "It was my wife, or a version of her, and she has gone back to the earth now." He could say that, and they would take him away, and the silence would be replaced by the clanging of doors and the murmurs of doctors. That would be one kind of end. Instead, he simply shook his head. "It was just the house settling," he said, his voice a monotone. "She startled a raccoon in the attic. It got out the back." Officer Miller looked at him for a long moment. He glanced down the hall, his gaze lingering on the clean, closed door of the sewing room. He looked at Fred's clean hands, his empty face. He saw a lonely man in a quiet house. A story he had seen a dozen times before. "Well," Miller said, slipping his hat back on, "I'll take a look around the yard and make sure it's gone. You might want to call a pest control guy, Fred. Seal up any holes." Fred gave a slow, single nod. The officer turned and left, his heavy footsteps a comfortingly mundane sound on the porch. Fred sat until he heard the police cruiser pull away. Then he stood and walked to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. The light was burned out. Inside was a carton of spoiled milk, a jar of pickles, and the casserole Martha had brought last week. He took out the casserole, pried off the lid, and scooped the cold, congealed mass into the trash. He washed the dish carefully, dried it, and placed it on the counter to be returned. He then went to the hall closet and took out a shovel. The metal blade was cool and smooth in his hand. He carried it out the back door into the small, overgrown yard. He did not look toward the oak tree. He walked to the center of the lawn, to a patch where the grass was thin and yellow. He pushed the blade into the earth. The work was hard, the ground unyielding. He did not know what he was digging for. He was not looking for the creature. He knew it was gone, dissolved back into the components from which it was borrowed. He was not digging a grave. He was just digging. The rhythm of it, the strain in his muscles, the solid reality of the dirt. These were things that required no thought, no meaning. They were just actions. The shovel bit into the soil, over and over, a dull, percussive beat to counter the hollow silence that now filled him. a silence far deeper and more absolute than any he had ever known. The hole grew deeper, a dark wound in the green of the lawn. Sweat dripped from his brow, mingling with the rich, dark soil. He did not stop. The physical exertion was a purge, a way to drown out the memory of the warm, decaying touch on his cheek and the sound of that single, stitched-together word. Alone. He was so absorbed in the rhythm of the labor that he did not hear the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path at the side of the house. He only looked up when a shadow fell across the hole he was digging. It was Mrs. Henderson from next door, her small dog straining at its leash. She was peering at him, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Fred, everything all right? That's quite a project for so early in the morning." He leaned on the shovel, his chest heaving. He looked from her face to the hole, then back again. He had no explanation. He could not say he was planting a tree or fixing a pipe. The hole was too deep, too raw. "Just digging," he said, the words tasting like dust. Mrs. Henderson's smile was tight and uncertain. Her little dog began to bark, a sharp, frantic sound that shattered the morning calm. It was pulling backward, its claws scrabbling on the gravel, trying to get away from the hole, from Fred, from the entire property. "Buster, hush now," she scolded, but her eyes stayed on Fred. They drifted past him, toward the old oak tree at the edge of his yard. Her expression changed. The polite concern melted away, replaced by a dawning, vague unease. "Well, don't work too hard now." She gave a quick, nervous tug on the leash and hurried away, casting one last, troubled glance over her shoulder. Fred watched her go. He looked toward the oak tree. Nothing seemed out of place. The shadows were deep and still. But something had spooked her dog. Something had spooked her. He climbed out of the hole, leaving the shovel standing upright in the pile of fresh earth. He walked across the lawn, his shoes sinking into the damp grass. As he neared the oak tree, the air grew cooler. The birdsong from the other trees seemed to fade, leaving a pocket of quiet under its sprawling branches. He saw it then. Not a footprint, not a sign of disturbance. It was a small, pale object lying among the gnarled roots. He knelt down. It was a single porcelain finger, smooth and perfect and clean. It was the index finger from the waitress's hand, the one that had touched his face. It must have snapped off during its lurching journey back to this place. He picked it up. It was cool and inert, just a piece of doll now. There was no warmth, no trace of the terrible animation that had possessed it. He held it in his palm, this last, discarded piece of his ambition. He knew then that it was not over. The circle was not closed. The silence he had assembled had not simply returned to the earth. It had left a piece of itself behind, a seed, and he was the only one who knew how to make it grow. He closed his hand around the finger. The cold porcelain, a stark contrast to the lingering memory of that other warmer touch. The hollow silence inside him shifted. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. He did not bury the finger. He carried it back into the house, into the sewing room, and placed it in the center of the clean, empty table. He sat in the straight-back chair and looked at it. It was a question. It was an answer. The day wore on. The phone rang twice. "Martha," he presumed. He did not answer. The world outside continued its noisy, oblivious life. But the house held its breath with him. The silence was no longer hollow. It was charged, like the air before a storm. It was a listening silence. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, turning the windows to violet, he stood up. He went to the closet and took out a small, locked metal box. Inside were his notebooks, the ones he had kept before Clara, before the long decline. They were filled with sketches, equations, theories about resonance and the persistence of memory in organic matter. He had thought it was all theoretical. He had been wrong. He opened a notebook to a clean page. He picked up a pencil. He did not look at the porcelain finger on the table. He did not need to. He began to draw. Not a human form this time. That ambition felt childish now, a mimicry of life he could never achieve. He drew something simpler. A vessel. A receiver. He worked through the night, the scratch of his pencil the only sound. He was not stitching together a body. He was designing a structure, a latticework of bone and wire and intention that could hold a silence, that could give it a single, pure voice. The finger was not a relic. It was a blueprint. It contained a resonance of the whole. He could use it. He could call the silence back, not as a broken mirror, but as a tool, a companion for the void. Just before dawn, he finished. The design on the paper was complex, beautiful in its own stark way. It looked like a skeletal music box, or the inner workings of a heart. He set the pencil down. His hand ached. His eyes were dry and tired. He looked at the porcelain finger. Then he reached out, and, with a calm, deliberate pressure, he pressed his thumb against its tip. He held it there, waiting. He did not know what he expected. A spark. A whisper. A sign. Nothing happened. The finger remained cold and dead. A slow smile spread across Fred's face. It was not a smile of joy or of madness. It was a smile of profound recognition. The failure was the lesson. The thing he had made had been warm with decay, with the messy, uncontrolled processes of life and death. This porcelain was sterile. It was pure. It could not hold what he needed to capture. He needed something warmer, something that had once been alive. He stood and walked to the kitchen. He opened the drawer by the sink. Inside, among the whisks and spatulas, lay a sharp, heavy cleaver. He picked it up. The weight felt good in his hand. Solid, stone, real, shun. He walked back to the sewing room and stood before the table. He laid his left hand flat upon its surface, palm down, fingers splayed. The dawnlight was just beginning to touch the window, casting the room in a soft, gray glow. He looked at his own hand, at the living flesh, the blood pumping just beneath the skin. It was the most capable thing he owned. It had built his loneliness. It would now become its vessel. He raised the cleaver high. The silence in the house was absolute. It was waiting. He brought the blade down,